Our book today is Jailbreak Out of History by Butch Lee. This is from the first chapter, Jailbreak Out of History, Harriet. Focus on Amazons, about why we deal with real women as myths, girls who never really existed. Yet and again, all are around us, and that we can't bring ourselves to see. Because seeing through white men's eyes is about non-vision of ourselves. So let's deal with a real Amazon. Think about Harriet Tubman. Take 6 months. In fact, take a year and think. Break it on down. What does it mean to be the most famous new African woman in U.S. history? What does it mean to be stuck in that lie? What's the meaning of being famous while being hidden and disfigured and dissed? Let's jailbreak Harriet Tubman out of white history and place her in Amazon and new African her story, her people's story. Harriet Tubman's life is a live weapon placed in our minds, showing us what it means to be an Amazon, which is why the capitalist patriarchy has forbidden us to touch on it for so long. In this, maybe for the first time, we can see Amazons as a future force in a clash of peoples and nations, not as myths, but as players in the whole difficult course of world politics. We can also appreciate the bittersweet tang of reality as the peeling away of layers of propaganda and disfigurement which have hidden Harriet from us exposes how much we assume and how little we have known. New African women have already pointed out the significant pattern of Harriet's exclusion. Cultural critic Bell Hooks said recently, if we could recover Ida B. Wells and Harriet Tubman to the extent that we've recovered, say, Zora Neale Hurston, I think that's an important contrast because people want to bury that revolutionary black female history. Historian Deborah Gray White connects Harriet's treatment to a larger pattern in the mainstream history of slavery, in which black women, quote, were reduced to insignificance and largely ignored, end quote. In examining the influential historian Stanley Elkins, she points out, quote, that Elkins seems to omit women altogether was accentuated by his description of slaves whom he identified as part of an American underground, those who never succumbed to Samboism. Among those mentioned were Gabriel, who led the revolt of 1820, Denmark Vesey, leading spirit of the 1822 plot at Charleston, and Nat Turner, an omission conspicuous by its absence, was Harriet Tubman. If Elkins had really been thinking of slaves of both sexes, he would hardly have forgotten this woman, who became widely known as the Moses of her people, end of quote. Patriarchal capitalisms, which only want Amazons to be exotic myths about forgotten ages, have hidden Harriet Tubman in her own fame. They both trivialize and exceptionalize her. These are tools of oppressor culture. The stripped down and censored version of her life is told in elementary schools all over the U.S. empire. So much so that everyone thinks they know her story already, although they don't. Harriet Tubman was born in slavery in Maryland around 1820. She escaped to the North when she was 29, but kept returning secretly to the South again and again to help other slaves escape. For this, she became known as Moses. True statements. But by limiting her, it becomes clever propaganda against her and against her people. Where patriarchy has been unable to deny that women do significant things, it denies the full meaning of what we do by trivializing them. Mary Daly, feminist philosopher, traces the enormity of what patriarchy has done to us. In ancient Greece, the goddess Hecate, also known as Artemis and Diana, was sometimes known as Trivia and represented by a three-faced statue. That was also the name used for the intersection of three paths, which in many old cultures were the sites of mystical power. She writes in Gynecology, quote, in light of the cosmic significance of the term trivia as the crossing of the three roads and of the goddess who bears this name, contemporary meaning of the term in English should be examined. The English term, which according to Merriam-Webster is derived from the Latin trivium or crossroads, is defined as common, ordinary, commonplace, of little worth or importance, insignificant, flimsy, minor, or slight. Of course, according to patriarchal values, that which is commonplace is of little worth. For in a competitive hierarchical society, scarcity is intrinsic to worth. Thus, gold is more important than fresh air, and consequently, we are forced to live in a world in which gold is easier to find than pure air. End quote. So to trivialize Harriet Tubman, the capitalist patriarchy pictures her as an idealized woman by their definition, who makes a life of helping others. Thus, her deeds are squeezed into women's assigned maternal role as nurturer, helper, and rescuer of men who then go on to do important things. But Harriet wasn't repping Mother Teresa. She wasn't even any kind of civilian at all. She was a combatant, a guerrilla, a warrior carrying pistol and rifle, fighting in her people's long war for freedom, a war that rocked the foundations of African society, American society, and that has never gone away. Think about what it means to be called Moses, which was the code name other new Africans gave her, and which became Harriet's famous warrior name in the anti-slavery underground. When we check out the Bible, we can see that Moses was a ruthless visionary, someone who forced the boldest changes and risks upon his people so that they could survive, who led them out of captivity. To put it simply, Moses was a leader in a time of war. So too was Harriet Tubman. The book, Jailbreak Out of History by Butch Lee.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Well, happy Wednesday, and happy the World War III didn't start yesterday. Boy, what a day. Anyhow, it's first hour Wednesday, so it's Middays with Mark. Congressman Mark Pocan with us for the hour, taking your calls at 202-808-9925. Congressman Pocan is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. He represents the state of Wisconsin, the 2nd District of Wisconsin, in the U.S. House of Representatives. His website, pocan.house.gov, and you can tweet him at Rep. Mark Pocan. Congressman, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom. Glad to be here.
And glad to have you. And I'm curious your thoughts on, the president just gave a speech. One of the things that really surprised me about his little speech was that he attacked Obama. He said that the weapons that the Iranians, the missiles that they threw at us were paid for by money that the American government under Obama's administration gave them. Words to that effect. He's talking about, of course, the Iranian money that was unfrozen. But we didn't give them any money. We simply unfroze their own money. It's like, how did this become normal? I've been watching CNN for 10 minutes or so, thereabouts, after this, and not a single person has commented on how weird it is to have a president attacking the previous president. I don't recall that ever happening literally in my lifetime. And I'm curious, your thoughts on just the whole thing. And I know that you and Representative Jayapal are proposing some legislation to prevent future wars with Iran. Let me just toss it all to you.
Yeah, specifically to the point, in the last 24 hours, this has been the big talking point on Fox News, that somehow it was Obama's fault, that the JCPOA was the problem. All I would remember is when we had that in effect, we did not have missiles coming back and forth. And I think, the problems have really started when the president pulled out of the agreement that would have made the region and the world safer. And then since then, it has gone downhill, especially with the president's actions, and yet to be seen the imminent threat that he's claimed. And we, in about an hour, and I'll have to wrap up 5 minutes early today, Tom, we do have a classified briefing, and we'll hopefully have some answers after that. We're doing a Progressive Caucus press conference a half hour after that ends. So, the president... we still have a lot of questions, from a president that unfortunately has not proven to be very trustworthy. We've yet to see his Twitter account, which is where he really talks. He was reading off a teleprompter there, but once he gets back to, his bedroom and his jammies, we got to be careful what he puts out on the Twitter account. If he gloats what he says, we don't know yet. And the bottom line is we're still not sure that we have any real reason why he did what he did. And those are the questions that we're going to get in about an hour.
Yeah, I mean, this is the big question. If 5 days after he was impeached, he decides, or maybe it was a little longer than that, but shortly after he's impeached and just before his trial is about to begin in the Senate, he assassinates, which is a really big word. I mean, it's a really, that's illegal unless there's an imminent risk to the United States. He assassinates the number 2 or number 3 official of a foreign government, of a sovereign country, on the property of a third sovereign country that's seriously PO'd about this. This does not seem to me like a good or wise course of action. It seems to me like he's trying to divert attention away from his impeachment, which he has successfully done now for 3 or 4 days. And, is Congress going to find out? We've had 3 different stories now from Pompeo about why this guy had to be killed now.
And these are the questions I think that we had this morning in our General Democratic Caucus that we're going to raise at the classified briefing. I went this morning to the SCIF, the secure facility, to read the 2-page reason why the president did what he did. And I can tell you nothing was addressed about an imminent threat. It went backwards looking at a few things, but there still has yet to be anything offered by this administration, publicly or not publicly, that shows an imminent threat. And that's the problem. Congress, unfortunately, for decades, has given up much of its power to presidents, both Democrat and Republican, when it comes to going into war, which is why what we're really trying to do, especially from the Progressive Caucus perspective, is we would like to see a good, strong war powers resolution. It may turn out to be a concurrent resolution because of some wording requirements in the Senate to make sure that it's privileged. But also we want to move the Ro Khanna legislation about going to war with Iran and the Barbara Lee legislation about reauthorizing Congress's ability to have its voice heard like it's supposed to, getting rid of the AUMF that was very loose after 9/11. So those are, and we've been working with our leadership, and they seem amenable to that. So if we can move a package of bills, perhaps we can finally start reclaiming Congress's role according to the Constitution, that we are the only people who are supposed to be there to declare war.
If his justification to Congress for assassinating, a senior official in a foreign government in broad daylight and claiming credit for it did not include any information arguing that there was an imminent threat to the United States that required this action at this time, has he not broken the law?
The problem is, if they are going to, I think what they may claim, and I shouldn't, I guess presuppose, but because they did it in Iraq and because the old authorizations involve Iraq, I think he's using that as having more latitude for what they did. That's my guess, because right now they have not yet given us that imminent threat. If you think at least in the declaration to Congress that I went and read in a classified setting, or at some point publicly in answering questions, they would have addressed it. I don't think there is an imminent threat. There wasn't an imminent threat, but because they did it in that third country's soil where an AUMF is very loose, I think that's going to be his declaration. I think anyone who looks at it rationally knows that's not what it was intended for, but this president doesn't think rationally.
Yeah, and strong reasons to support Barbara Lee's legislation and what you and Representative Jayapal are proposing. So should we pick up some phone calls here?
Sure,
okay.
Absolutely.
Stephen in Albuquerque, New Mexico. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Yes, thank you, Mark and Tom. My question is, the Buckley decision that you've discussed on your program often in 1976, and then later the Citizens United, we've had presidents in the Democratic Party that have had Congress and the Senate on their side, and yet it seems like over the last 35, 40 years, we've never been able to approach the subject and change it. I know it's unconstitutional, and I would like to know, is there any future positivity towards changing these things?
Yeah, I mean, we've passed legislation, including with H.R. 1, the very first bill we numbered in Congress, to try to address Citizens United. Clearly, we think Congress would like to have a say on what's being said rather than just the Supreme Court. However, we're not seeing any movement from the Republicans. They don't want to change the system that essentially gives them a bit of an edge because they have some deeper pocket individuals that can hide money through these 527 and other organizations and be able to do it often undisclosed. So it is something that we absolutely have to get done. That's why I'm very supportive of all the move to amend organizations around the country that are trying to raise this issue. It really is as simple as a corporation is not a person and money is not free speech. And as long as we all agree with that, which the public strongly does, we should be able to try to reverse Citizens United.
Michelle in Albuquerque, New Mexico. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, I'm interested in knowing what is the plan of the Democratic Party to actually, when at the time of the election, help people protect their voter rights when they go out to vote. I know that these bills are on Mitch McConnell's desk, waiting for him to act on them, but we know he's not going to. So what is Plan B? What are the Democrats actually going to do to protect people's voter rights and boots on the ground, help them to get out to the polls and get their vote counted?
Yeah, well, I think, Michelle, let me answer it in two different ways. One, there's always efforts to do what we all call GOTV, get out the vote, to make sure that you're getting people out to vote as much as possible. We know people agree with Democrats on the issues. If you get them to vote, we're more likely to win. So that's kind of a 101 of what we need to do, and rather than putting money on TV commercials, I would argue a field operation is far more valuable. But two, there's a lot of organizations, including the Democratic Party, working on this, they're going to be at the polls with poll watchers and things to make sure that people aren't losing their ability to vote, especially in states where it's a problem. States like Wisconsin, quite honestly, when Scott Walker in his last term put in a voter ID law, we think in 2016, according to the University of Wisconsin, over 40,000 people were disenfranchised from their right to vote. And it's a state that Donald Trump won by 23,000 votes. So there are efforts, and there will be efforts, not just by the Democratic Party, by Eric Holder's group that President Obama's involved with, and others towards that end.
It's Middays with Mark. Wednesday, first hour, Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. He's the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, the big cheese progressive in the U.S. House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., and along with Pramila Jayapal. He represents the 2nd District of Wisconsin. His website, Pocan, POCAN.house.gov. You can tweet him at @RepMarkPocan.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And we'll be back in just a moment with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan. And welcome back. Adam in New Orleans, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, good morning. We can't let Trump, the GOP, and captive media divert the public from impeachment. And I want to propose an approach and get your thoughts on something rather extraordinary. Can the House hold McConnell and Lindsey Graham, let's just say McConnell, in contempt of Congress? I'll take the question off here.
Adam, I don't have an answer for you on that. I don't know, and I don't necessarily see how we could. I'm sure there are some people who may be trying to come up with ways that we could. I don't know how we could, in the House of Representatives, do that to someone in the Senate. Now, the Senate could, but again, with the makeup and their rules, I think it's pretty unlikely. But we're yet to see what Mitch McConnell's going to do. I mean, right now he's claiming he's going to move ahead, but how could he move ahead without the actual articles of impeachment? Again, I think Nancy Pelosi is doing the absolute right thing by holding them back, trying to get a fair trial in the Senate. Every day that goes by, more information comes out, whether it be about emails, the 91 minutes after the call, about holding the funds to Ukraine, whether it be now with Mr. Bolton being willing to testify. I also think that we should be subpoenaing him before the House. So I think every day more information comes out.
Paul in Glenside, Pennsylvania. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, Congressman Pocan. I'd like to express my concern for limiting the power of the president when it comes to war acts. I think we all know it's in the Constitution that power lies with the Senate and the Congress. However, can this Congress pass a legislation specifying that President Trump can take no action whatsoever against any Iranian national for any reason at all, whether there's a mysterious plot or not? And just to point out my concern, I'm from the Philadelphia area. We had the largest oil refinery on the East Coast blow up. You could see it from the International Space Station. It was a horrific event and unleashed a lot of toxic material. That was a very clear danger to the people of Philadelphia. Yet I don't see the president taking any concern. But some mysterious plot apparently will be stopped by getting rid of a general, which I find hard to believe because, next man up. The next general will just pull the trigger on that plot. So what can we do to specifically stop him from trying to get us into a war with Iran?
Yeah, so we're trying to do three things. One, either a war powers resolution, or it may turn out to be a concurrent resolution because of some language issues to make it privileged going to the Senate, but that's being worked out, that will try to reestablish Congress's power. Two, Ro Khanna has legislation that does just that, says that you can't go to war with Iran, essentially. And three, Barbara Lee has legislation that would make us get a new authorization to go to war, a new AUMF, so that we don't have the loose one that's being abused by so many presidents, at least we think, taking that power away from Congress. So it's really those three steps. That's what we've recommended as the Progressive Caucus. We're working with Democratic leadership to do just that, and I think that's the direction you're going to see moving forward.
And that's if people were to call 202-225-3121, the congressional switchboard, and talk to their member of the House, what specifically would they say?
I think you say, I support a war powers resolution. I support the legislation by Ro Khanna and Barbara Lee.
Great.
And if you do that, I think that's the strongest message.
Great. Thank you, Congressman. We'll be right back. And welcome back. 21 minutes past the hour. Dave in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan. Dave? I am not hearing Dave. Let's try Joe in Union City, Michigan. Hey, Joe, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hey, Tom. First of all, I'd like to say that you, Amy Goodman, David Pacman, and the Young Turks are absolute national treasures.
Bless you, Joe.
I'm a 58-year-old Bernie bro. I feel the burn. And I'd like to ask the congressman what can be done to stop Trump from messing with Social Security disability.
I'll tell you, so many of these issues, and I hate to say it because it sounds overly simplistic, but I don't think you can say it enough, is that elections have consequences. And the president, unfortunately, through executive action, can do some things, especially when you have a split Congress, and we can't together block the president from doing that. So as long as you have him in the White House and a Republican Senate, it is hard. We can try to do some things as we have through appropriations and other language and try to get to a deal on them down the road, which is what we just did on a budget bill. But boy, that's not easy, and a lot of people can be hurt along the way. So we are absolutely trying to address that issue, but the reality is it's going to be a lot more difficult not having a Senate in place.
David in St. Paul, Minnesota, listening on AM 950. You're on the air, David, with Congressman Pocan.
Yeah, thanks for taking my call. Hey, I was just wondering, I would like there to be a proposal on a war tax or some defense bill tax as far as these weapon manufacturers. They should not be allowed to make profit on making weapons that go and destroy other countries. We don't make anything in the U.S. anymore except weapons that destroy other countries. So I just, maybe we can put it into our general fund to promote wellness country and or wellness and to promote peace and prosperity in other countries, and maybe promote like a Green Deal for the rest of the world to be able to be self-sufficient and self-sustaining and improve our world. So that's my comment today. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Sure, David. Or I think another thing that I would recommend is we realize that in the last 3 years, we've increased defense spending 20% at a time of peace. And what we really need to do is get a grip on how much we're spending on the military and what we're giving other countries, essentially to do the same and enabling them when it comes to the military, and realize that much of that money is not productively used in the economy and doesn't put us any safer. In fact, it puts us greater at risk. I mean, I think that's the big issue. Tom, before I got to Congress, the sequester was passed, and for 10 years it linked non-defense and defense spending together in discretionary spending. That link comes off in 2021. We should be preparing for that time period, especially where they're delinked, to be able to invest back in non-defense spending and cut back in defense spending and be wiser and follow the audits and everything we should be doing that we do for everything else and we don't do for defense. I would argue just spending less in this area and spending more wisely and spending on troops as opposed to weapons would be a vast step forward. And I think it's part of our responsibility in Congress and the public to mobilize around this, knowing that there's a unique opportunity coming up very soon.
Justin in Lincoln, Nebraska, you're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hey, thanks for taking my call. You guys are just talking about defense spending. I kind of want to talk about peace, but before that, I just want to mention General Dynamics is out here in Lincoln. It looks like they're adding on a new addition to their factory. Talk about defense spending. But peace talks, what are we going to do where's the peace spending? What are we going to do to, who are we going to send over there to talk to them? I'm just wondering, how's that going to look? Thanks.
Yeah, Justin, you bring up a really good point, because Secretary Pompeo has been the lead hawk when it comes to Iran, and he's supposed to be the Secretary of State, which is the department that supposedly would go and do diplomatic efforts. So the head diplomat, I guess you could say, has been the head war hawk when it comes to Iran, which makes it very difficult. Also, we have virtually no channels between the United States and Iran right now, and we have to establish those through some third parties. So there's a lot of work that has to happen with a seriously flawed State Department from the top anyway, and you raise a very, very, very valid point, Justin, that we need to take into consideration as we're talking about the Middle East.
When we just have 40 seconds here, when former members of Congress particularly Dennis Kucinich, have proposed a Department of Peace, and Marianne Williamson has brought that back up again in the presidential candidate campaign, the rebuttal is always, well, that's the job of the Department of State, is to maintain peace, and defense is the one that argues for wars. How do we deal with this when we've got a Secretary of State who's actually more interested apparently in war than in peace, and seems to be motivated by his desire to return Jesus to the earth by having a war in the Middle East? And he actually gave a speech to that effect.
Yeah, that's the very problem, right? And now we can't trust the Secretary of State to do the job of a Secretary of State, and we have no channels in particular to communicate to Iran. So on top of the president making a decision probably with no imminent threat, we also don't have the capacity to move forward in peace in this region like we should.
Yeah, that's troubling. Congressman Mark Pocan is with us for the hour, short the last 10 minutes. Taking your, because he's got a briefing he's got to go to, taking your calls. We'll be right back with more of your calls for Congressman Pocan.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
He is the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, represents Wisconsin, pocan.house.gov. You can tweet him at Rep. Mark Pocan. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is The Entrepreneurial State by Mariana Mazzucato, and this is from the introduction titled Thinking Big Again. Across the globe, countries, including in the developing world, look to emulate the success of the U.S. economy. In doing so, they look at the power of, quote, market-driven, end quote, mechanisms versus what might seem like old-style state-driven mechanisms in places like Europe or the ex-Soviet Union. But the United States is not what it seems. The preacher of the small state free market doctrine has for decades been directing large public investment programs in technology and innovation that underlie its past and current economic success. From the internet to biotech and even shale gas, the U.S. state has been the key driver of innovation-led growth, willing to invest in the most uncertain phase in the innovation cycle and let business hop on for the easier ride down the way. If the rest of the world wants to emulate the U.S. model, they should do as the United States actually did, not as it says it did. More state, not less. A key part of this lesson should be to learn how to organize, direct, and evaluate state investments so that they can be strategic, flexible, and mission-oriented. Only in this way will top minds find it an honor to work for the state. This is something that needs to be understood not only by the rest of the world, but in the United States itself, where the dominant political narrative is endangering funding for future innovation and economic growth. In 2013, U.S. government spending for basic research fell below what it was a decade earlier, and most likely will continue to fall due to congressional gridlock over the public budget. Rather than static discussions about the size of the deficit, there must be more debate about its actual composition. How to invest strategically in key areas such as research and development, R&D, education, and human capital formation that will increase gross domestic product, the GDP, in the future, bringing the debt-GDP ratio down as a consequence. And how to engage in a debate about the direction of change so that such investments will lead to growth that is not only smarter, that is innovation-led, but also more inclusive and sustainable. These issues are urgent with the upcoming 2016 U.S. presidential election, which could, if properly informed, change the parameters of the current static debate. The United States desperately needs politicians with the courage to swim against the tide of popular rhetoric and outline a bolder vision for the state's dynamic role in fostering the economic growth of the future. In emerging economies such as China, the public sector is indeed investing billions in green technologies with the expectation that these industries will be the engines of future growth. The United States could take inspiration from its own history. In 1961, an American president set out a bold, ambitious, and risky mission to send a man to the moon. Who will have the courage to set out a new vision for America today? Addressing today's societal challenges, for example, those around climate change, requires a vision, a mission, and most of all, confidence about the state's role in the economy. As eloquently argued by Keynes in The End of Laissez-Faire, 1926, the important thing for government is not to do things which individuals are doing already and to do them a little better or a little worse, but to do those things which at present are not done at all. End of quote. This, however, requires the public sector to have vision and confidence, increasingly missing today. Why? What is the role of the public sector in economic growth? After the financial crisis, with public budgets bloated, mainly due to their role in saving the private sector, across the globe we are hearing that in order for nations to be competitive, innovative, and dynamic, we must have more market and less state. As at best, we are told, governments merely facilitate the economic dynamism of the private sector. At worst, their lumbering, heavy-handed, and bureaucratic institutions actively inhibit it. The fast-moving, risk-loving, and pioneering private sector, by contrast, is what really drives the type of innovation that creates economic growth. According to this view, the secret behind an engine of innovation like Silicon Valley lies in its entrepreneurs and venture capitalists. The state can intervene in the economy, but only to fix market failures or to level the playing field. It can regulate the private sector in order to account for the external costs companies may impose on the public, like pollution, and it can invest in public goods, such as basic scientific research or the development of drugs with little market potential. To some, on the political right, even fixing market failures would be a sin, because such attempts would lead to worse outcomes in the form of government failures. What all these views have in common is the assumption that the state should stick to fixing markets, not directly try to create and shape them. A 2012 Economist article on the future of manufacturing encapsulates this common misperception. This book is committed to dismantling this false image, which underpins a global trend promoted by conservative economists, politicians, and the media of bashing and diminishing the importance of the state. It focuses on what Tony Judt called a discursive battle. How we talk about the state matters. Depicting private business as the innovative force while the state is cast as the inertial one, necessary for the basics but too large and heavy to be the dynamic engine, is a description that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we continue to depict the state, continues. So the book is The Entrepreneurial State by Mariana Mazzucato.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and it's Middays with Mark. Congressman Mark Pocan taking your calls for the hour. Congressman, I just found a 22-second clip, phone calls you've gotten earlier. May I play it for you and get your thoughts?
Please, please.
This is from Franklin Roosevelt that I think is real appropriate to this moment, and two of them from one of his fireside chats during World War II.
Our present emergency and a common sense of decency make it imperative that no new group of war millionaires shall come into being in this nation as a result of the struggles abroad. The American people will not relish the idea of any American citizen growing rich and fat in an emergency of blood and slaughter and human suffering.
Your thoughts?
Yeah.
When we had statesmen, right?
Yeah. The problem is, Donald Trump often, when he's talked about, other countries and assistance, it always comes in the terms of military aid and along those lines. And we need to have something other than that. It's the old traditional. People think we spend too much on other money with other countries. Yet it's less than 1% of the overall budget. Yet that's the amount that keeps us out of situations like this, where then we spend $738 billion annually on defense, a new record high after going up 20% in 3 years at a time of peace, which makes no sense. I mean, there needs to be much more done in this area, and I think we need to have a very a national campaign to address some of these issues, because what we're spending on defense is money that could go to other things that would be much more directly beneficial to the American people.
Yeah, man. I mean, Roosevelt actually, when Truman was just a senator, put Truman in charge of a commission to investigate war profiteering. I mean, they were busting defense companies left and right. It's amazing. Anyhow, Zoe in Encino, California. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Happy New Year to you, Tom, and to Congressman Pocan. Thank you both for what you do. You make our world a lot better, and especially in these times. It just seems to get worse and worse every day. And my question to you is, I am sick of paying a salary to Mitch McConnell and all of those people that are sitting on their rear ends and not doing their job. There has to be some way we Americans can call them on that. I know the vote is one of the ways, but time is marching on, and we're just getting more and more into serious trouble, and we're making enemies all over the world. We've got to hold these people responsible. It is not right for them to get a salary when they're not doing anything except blocking the progress of our country and all the other countries in the world by doing the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Zoe, I could agree with you more. As of 6 or 8 weeks ago, we have sent over 400 bills to the U.S. Senate from the House, 275 of which have had bipartisan support. And I think the percent is around 15% of the bills that Mitch McConnell's actually passed, because, one, he's been busy passing conservative judges, and they're really remaking the courts, unfortunately, during this administration. But second, he refuses to do anything else, and not even trying to cooperate with us. I mean, other than the budget bill that we all had to do, you have to get that done every year. There's been very little action out of the Senate under Mitch McConnell, and he really is just so afraid of the Trump hardcore supporters. I think it'll be interesting after we get past some of this primary season, Tom, where people can register or run against Republicans if they have a more fortified spine at that point. But right now, they're just so afraid of that Trump base that they'll do anything the president wants. And at some point, I think when this president's gone, how are you going to rebuild the Republican Party after they've taken all these very weak stances other than just following Donald Trump like a cult leader?
Yeah. Jim in Valley Center, California. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Congressman Pocan, I really hope that we can answer this question you'll ask this question with your colleagues. Last night we had a missile attack. We're supposed to have the finest and greatest army in the world, and we don't fire a missile to shoot them down. I can't understand that. I thought we had the Iron Dome that we paid for in Israel. This is something that really worries me. Why were they not shot down before they landed?
Yeah, I don't know offhand, Jim. I mean, one of the questions we want to ask, I know, is was Iraq notified by us before we did what we did? And from what we're hearing last night, Iraq was notified in advance to what Iran did. In fact, it looks like they purposely made sure they did no human damage in their response, which we believe is not the final response. It likely now is going to go to surrogates and other groups in that region, and this isn't over at all. That's the very honest, real fear that we have. So there are many of the questions that we have, plus what was the imminent threat, because we have yet to seen that imminent threat. And the president did it without. That is an abuse of his constitutional power, and which is why Congress has to act on that front.
Dave in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Want to try it again, Dave?
Yeah, sure. Hey, I'm sorry about that. I think I dropped the call right when you went to me earlier, but I appreciate you coming back to me. I was listening when we fielded the call earlier on voter ID laws, and I had mixed feelings on voter ID laws, but it is a common progressive talking point that somehow those laws themselves are racist. And my question is, I guess I'm just wanting to know the reasoning behind that. I mean, I have two biracial children, and I kind of find it a little bit of offensive that they can't figure out how to get a voter ID as opposed to any other race. I was just wondering if you can kind of give me the thought behind that.
Sure, Dave. And this I can give you from 14 years of experience in a state legislature, now 7 years in Congress. What we have found when you have voter ID laws, first of all, there isn't voter fraud. People aren't going to risk going to prison in order to vote, to have that simple act. And I got PolitiFacted, one of those things that verifies whether people are saying things true or not on this issue, and I got one of their rare truths. They don't like to give out truths. When I said you're more likely to be struck by lightning than commit voter fraud, and that's true. So it is extremely rare that someone actually commits voter fraud with the intent to vote. So that's, I think, the first fact. The second is certain people don't have IDs on them. If you don't have a car, you may not need a driver's license. So that affects people often in lower income areas, often in inner cities, which often corresponds with race in many of the areas. It also affects many seniors who don't drive anymore. My mother, who's 90, is one of those people that gets impacted, and sometimes college students. So there are impacted people by having voter ID laws. So one, if there isn't an existing problem, which is proven by the statistic on lightning strikes, and two, there is a problem if you have a photo ID requirement by certain populations. It's going to make it more difficult. That's the reason why many of us have advocated for not having those sorts of laws. And in Wisconsin, when Scott Walker implemented that law, we have same-day registration. We've had a great history. It used to be one of the top 3 voting states in the country in presidential races. We, at the University of Wisconsin, estimated based on their research, 41,000 people were likely impacted by that law and weren't able to vote that day. And it's a day that Donald Trump happened to win by 23,000 votes. Whenever you have numbers like that, you know you've got a problem.
Yeah, amen. And you're going to have to leave us at 10 minutes before the hour. Am I remembering that right?
Yes. I'm sorry. I have to make sure I just get over there to.
Yeah, it's all good. I'm just trying to plan this out because we've got a 4-minute break here. So when we come back, we'll take a question or two, and then a 10 minutes till we'll bail out. Okay, great. Congressman Mark Pocan is with us, taking your calls. It's Middays with Mark. Pocan.house.gov is his website. You can tweet him at Rep. Mark Pocan.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
And, of course, he's the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and represents the 2nd District of Wisconsin in the U.S. House of Representatives. And welcome back. Jules, listening on KPFK in Whittier, California. You're on the air with Congressman Pocan.
Hi, Congressman Tom. Love your show. I've been thinking about this emoluments clause and so on. We have a lot of articles that are potential ammunition, let's say, against Trump. The other thing I want to say is this whole military spending. Actually, the myth is that the more business you get militarily, spending, that the economy improves. And that's actually a falsehood. When World War I, they started building up the machine Wilson, and they were actually running the supplies for all of the Allies. And so naturally we got drawn into the war. But from that point, 100 years later, we've been in this military-industrial mode, you could say, which is a cancer. It swallowed up Germany and other countries, but it has now swallowed up the United States. And just like a cancer, it takes the machinery of the industrial base, and just like a virus, owns it. But the other thing I want to say is, this whole thing with this military stuff. Emma Goldman was an anarchist. I don't know if you remember. I like to read her speech, Preparedness.
Jules, I'm sorry, we don't have time for a speech, but Congressman, if you want to speak to his thoughts.
Sure. I think, first on the military spending, I mean, there certainly is not efficiency in military spending. We know that. Therefore, much of what Jules brought up makes sense why it doesn't benefit the economy. But even more important, I think, it's one of the problems why we have this problem with military spending is that they have a footprint across the whole country, and almost everyone has some jobs in their district, and that's why it's often hard for some people who should vote against some of the funding to vote against the funding. That's why I think maybe so few of us, myself included, voted against the National Defense Authorization because of the level of funding, just because that makes it more difficult, and I think that's important to raise. Second, just to Emoluments Clause, I do think there's a lot more to happen there, and I think if we ever got his taxes, that would also show us an awful lot towards that.
There you go. Larry in Los Angeles, listening on KPFK. We got about 1 minute and 20 seconds, Larry, to the break. Quick one.
Okay, I'm glad I caught the congressman just in time. The Social Security windfall elimination tax, do you know if Congress is ever going to repeal that? Because I'm retired, and that extra couple of $100, I could sure use it.
Yeah, tax policy is extra tough now because of what Donald Trump and the Republicans did last session by putting us now $1 trillion into deficit. That bill alone is going to cost about, I think, 1.7 or 1.9 trillion. It's hard to get back and do tax fairness. If they would have gone in and did tax reform, you'd have winners and losers, but you'd have done it in hopefully a logical way. They didn't do tax reform. They took away some things, but largely just passed on a tax cut to the wealthiest. And that makes it even harder because tax dollars like that are really tax expenditures and make it harder to address some of the other issues. So I don't have a time and place answer for you, Larry, other than pointing out why it might be a little more difficult.
Was what he was referring to, was that when Reagan started taxing Social Security income?
I couldn't tell you the timeline exactly on it, but there's a number of things that would make sense to reform in the tax code. Paul Ryan, who supposedly was for tax reform, but he never did tax reform. Right. He just passed tax cuts. Right.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, we'll be right back with more 2 minutes of questions for Congressman Pocan, and then he's out of here. Stick around. No, it's all good. I understand. We want you to do your job. We'll be right back. It's 47 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. It's 47 to 48 minutes past the hour. This question will be the last question for Congressman Pocan because he's got to run to a classified conference or meeting or whatever it is, and I'll pick up the rest of your questions. So recalibrate them. D, listening on AM 910 out of San Francisco. You're in Oakland. Do you have a question for Congressman Pocan?
Yeah, thanks. The earlier caller that asked about missiles and how we have the capability to knock them out before they land. This might sound a little crazy. Let me know your thoughts, but do you think Pompeo or whoever wanted something to happen? Maybe they wanted the missiles to land, and then we have a casualty and an excuse to do more.
Yeah, I mean, those systems are, first of all, are never perfect. I mean, I've seen it in what we have in Israel right now, for example. And while it can take out some of the missiles, you don't take out everything. So I don't think the technology is there to do that. Otherwise, you could have a very different situation about how we spend defense spending. So I don't think there's much to be read out of that. I think what should be read out of what happened last night is they notified Iraq ahead of time, and they purposely hit areas where there were no human casualties. And that was, I think, Iran sending a very specific message that they can do things, but they weren't going to. But we think this means surrogates and others will probably start taking control and doing more things. And I don't think this is over at all. And I think once the president gets a hold of his Twitter account, who knows what will happen next. So unfortunately, I think we are still going to live through this for quite a while due to the president's very poor decision-making and doing the assassination that he did.
Yeah, amen. Congressman, thanks so much for being with us today, and again this week.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I think hopefully we'll know a little more later today about if there really was any real information out there, an imminent threat. My guess is I'm going to come back with nothing.
Yeah. Well, you're always welcome to come on this program and share the story, or let us know however you'd like. So good luck.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks for keeping us up to date.
Yep.
Congressman Mark Pocan, his website pocan.house.gov. You can tweet him at Rep. Mark Pocan. Co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, represents Wisconsin in the U.S. House. And if you're still on hold with a question for Congressman Pocan, he's gone. I'll do my best. If you don't have a question for me, just hang up and let somebody through who might. So. To continue, Karen in Kirkland, Washington. Hey, Karen, what's on your mind today?
Good morning, Tom. So nice to talk with you. I wanted to know if you had any information or could get any information on, in the various states where voter ID is required, what are our members of Congress or the people in the states, the Democratic parties, doing to get the proper photo ID and ID for those people who are elderly, who can't get the photo ID for whatever reason, getting the photo ID so that they can get registered to vote.
Right. I just wrote a book about this. It's called The Hidden History of the War on Voting, Who Stole Your Vote and How to Get It Back. And I spent the last year researching this topic, Karen, so it's a good, timely question. And, the bottom line is that it varies from state to state. Some states have made it so difficult to get people registered to vote or even help people register to vote. For example, or even get their ID as part of the process of registering to vote. Like Florida, if you make one mistake, if you put a period after somebody's middle initial when there's not supposed to be one there, or you spell one letter wrong, you can go to prison in Florida. And that's why the League of Women Voters has stopped doing basically all support for voting in Florida, because the Republicans in Florida, Rick Scott, when he was governor, basically criminalized helping people get on the voter rolls and stay on the voter rolls and all that kind of stuff. Other states, no big deal. South Dakota, for example, same-day registration, no ID necessary. Of course, South Dakota is like probably 99% white outside of the Indian reservations, and they actually make it very difficult for people on the Indian reservations to vote. So, but that's but it varies just dramatically from state to state. Did I answer your question, Karen?
Sort of. I just wanted to make sure that the Democratic parties in each of these states are actually really trying to help the people get registered.
Yeah, there's a group here in Portland. I believe it's called the Portland Progressive Fund that is doing that kind of work, helping people get registered. There's other groups like that, but every state has their own unique group. Stacey Abrams has put together a real kick-ass group in Georgia. I believe that she's trying to expand that nationally. We should probably have her on the program and discuss this. But it used to be, it was the NAACP, it was ACORN, and it was the League of Women Voters, and basically all of them have been pushed out. ACORN was destroyed, and the rest of them were pushed out of that business at the national level of registering because they had the temerity to be registering largely people of color, and God forbid, right? And so the wrath of the Republicans came down on them. Karen, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. Carmen, is it Carmen or Carmine in Whitefish, Montana? Carmen?
Yes, sir. I wanted to say, Tom, that I'm tired of the obstruction from the Republican senators, and I personally believe, as a three-star combat vet, that we're now the United States of Russia when the sock puppet president for Putin is Trump. And I want to know, could the whole representative Republican senatorial side who obstructs everything and creates all these problems, could they be complicit in the overthrow of our democracy?
Oh, I think it's, to a large extent, it's already happened, and it started with the Supreme Court. It started with packing the Supreme Court. This is, and in fact, in the hidden history of the Supreme Court, I lay out exactly how Nixon committed treason to become president, Reagan committed treason to become president, George W. Bush committed treason to become president. I mean, or to get reelected specifically. The coup has already happened. And it started in 1976 with the Buckley decision. And somebody had called and asked Congressman Pocan about that. And yeah, we've got to fix that. Al in Zanesville, Ohio. Hey, Al, what's on your mind?
Hi. I didn't know if you wanted to get back to the war funding issue.
Sure.
And that I was referencing FDR, and then you played that tape.
Mm-hmm.
And a previous caller talked about profits. But maybe we could approach it the way Obama did with the healthcare providers, putting a cap on the profits if it went above 20%. He refunded a bunch of people.
Right.
Would that be an approach we could take to these industrial, complex?
Yeah, it would be sort of a variation on the windfall profits tax that I think was passed by Jerry Ford. It might have been Jimmy Carter, but it was basically in the back end of the oil crisis. There was a bunch of people in the oil business who were suddenly making piles of money, and we put a temporary windfall profits tax on that. And I think we should be able to do the same thing with the military. Thanks for the call, Nick in Detroit. Hey, Nick, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I have a question in regards to Social Security. I'm currently a junior in college, and once I graduate, I'll be entering the workforce. Ever since FDR first instituted Social Security, the payroll tax has gone from 1% to about 12-13% now, which both is shared by both the employee and the employer. But my question is, how do given that Social Security will not be able to fully pay out the benefits sometime within the next 2 decades, how do we keep paying out the full benefits to my generation?
Right. Right now, I mean, Social Security is sitting on $2.7 trillion in surplus. That surplus was specifically created by double taxing my generation, the boomers. Back in 82, the decision was made by Reagan that they were going to double the Social Security tax, and that that money was going to be built up because there was this huge demographic, this rabbit going through the python of the boomer generation retiring. Once the boomer generation retires, Social Security doesn't need that surplus. They didn't have that surplus before 82. Never had it. It was always cash in, cash out. So, but to your point, right now, if nothing changes, starting about 30 years out, Social Security would only be able to pay 70% of benefits forever. But if you simply lifted the cap, right now, if you make more than $130,000, you pay nothing into Social Security. If you made it so that somebody paying $200,000, $300,000, somebody making $1 million a year paid the exact same amount into Social Security that you and I do, Nick, Social Security would be solvent forever. That's the solution.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Our book today is Jailbreak Out of History by Butch Lee. This is from the first chapter, Jailbreak Out of History, Harriet. Focus on Amazons, about why we deal with real women as myths, girls who never really existed. Yet and again, all are around us, and that we can't bring ourselves to see. because seeing through white men's eyes is about non-vision of ourselves. So let's deal with the real Amazon. Think about Harriet Tubman. Take 6 months. In fact, take a year and think. Break it on down. What does it mean to be the most famous new African woman in U.S. history? What does it mean to be stuck in that lie? What's the meaning of being famous while being hidden and disfigured and dissed? Let's jailbreak Harriet Tubman out of white history and place her in Amazon and new African her story, her people's story. Harriet Tubman's life is a live weapon placed in our minds, showing us what it means to be an Amazon, which is why the capitalist patriarchy has forbidden us to touch on it for so long. In this, maybe for the first time, we can see Amazons as a future force in a clash of peoples and nations, not as myths, but as players in the whole difficult course of world politics. We can also appreciate the bittersweet tang of reality as the peeling away of layers of propaganda and disfigurement which have hidden Harriet from us exposes how much we assume and how little we have known. New African women have already pointed out the significant pattern of Harriet's exclusion. Cultural critic Bell Hooks said recently, if we could recover Ida B. Wells and Harriet Tubman to the extent that we've recovered, say, Zora Neale Hurston, I think that's an important contrast because people want to bury that revolutionary black female history. Historian Deborah Gray White connects Harriet's treatment to a larger pattern in the mainstream history of slavery, in which black women, quote, were reduced to insignificance and largely ignored, end quote. In examining the influential historian Stanley Elkins, she points out, quote, that Elkins seems to omit women altogether was accentuated by his description of slaves whom he identified as part of an American underground, those who never succumbed to Samboism. Among those mentioned were Gabriel, who led the revolt of 1820, Denmark Vesey, leading spirit of the 1822 plot at Charleston, and Nat Turner, an omission conspicuous by its absence, was Harriet Tubman. If Elkins had really been thinking of slaves of both sexes, he would hardly have forgotten this woman who became widely known as the Moses of her people, end of quote. Patriarchal capitalisms, which only want Amazons to be exotic myths about forgotten ages, have hidden Harriet Tubman in her own fame. They both trivialize and exceptionalize her. These are tools of oppressor culture. The stripped down and censored version of her life is told in elementary schools all over the U.S. empire. So much so that everyone thinks they know her story already, although they don't. Harriet Tubman was born in slavery in Maryland around 1820. She escaped to the North when she was 29, but kept returning secretly to the South again and again to help other slaves escape. For this, she became known as Moses. True statements. But by limiting her, it becomes clever propaganda against her and against her people. Where patriarchy has been unable to deny that women do significant things, it denies the full meaning of what we do by trivializing them. Mary Daly, feminist philosopher, traces the enormity of what patriarchy has done to us. In ancient Greece, the goddess Hecate, also known as Artemis and Diana, was sometimes known as Trivia and represented by a three-faced statue. That was also the name used for the intersection of three paths, which in many old cultures were the sites of mystical power. She writes in Gynecology, quote, in light of the cosmic significance of the term trivia as the crossing of the three roads and of the goddess who bears this name, contemporary meaning of the term in English should be examined. The English term, which according to Merriam-Webster is derived from the Latin trivium or crossroads, is defined as common, ordinary, commonplace, of little worth or importance, insignificant, flimsy, minor, or slight. Of course, according to patriarchal values, that which is commonplace is of little worth. For in a competitive hierarchical society, scarcity is intrinsic to worth. Thus, gold is more important than fresh air, and consequently, we are forced to live in a world in which gold is easier to find than pure air. End quote. So to trivialize Harriet Tubman, the capitalist patriarchy pictures her as an idealized woman by their definition, who makes a life of helping others. Thus, her deeds are squeezed into women's assigned maternal role as nurturer, helper, and rescuer of men, who then go on to do important things. But Harriet wasn't repping Mother Teresa. She wasn't even any kind of civilian at all. She was a combatant, a guerrilla, a warrior carrying pistol and rifle, fighting in her people's long war for freedom, a war that rocked the foundations of African society, American society, and that has never gone away. Think about what it means to be called Moses, which was the code name other new Africans gave her, and which became Harriet's famous warrior name in the anti-slavery underground. When we check out the Bible, we can see that Moses was a ruthless visionary, someone who forced the boldest changes and risks upon his people so that they could survive, who led them out of captivity. To put it simply, Moses was a leader in a time of war. So too was Harriet Tubman. The book Jailbreak Out of History by Butch Lee. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. So Congressman Pocan was with us for the first hour, and so I didn't want to get into a protracted rant about my opinion and my reading, as it were, my research, my learning, whatever, on where we're at, what happened, what has happened in the last 24 hours in particular. But I want to share this with you in a fairly unvarnished fashion, and love to get your thoughts on it. First of all, if you go back to the invasion of Iraq, both invasions of Iraq, in fact, we invaded Iraq back in I think it was 91 when George Herbert Walker Bush was president, and that was going to get him reelected in 92. It didn't work out that well. As his son pointed out, his war only lasted 100 hours. He should have been at war all the way up to election day if he wanted to get himself reelected. This is what George W. Bush said. In fact, Cindy Sheehan laid this out, and I think fairly brilliantly. And this is on the 360, Sean. Just as a reminder.
As a matter of fact, in interviews in 1999 with respected journalists and longtime Bush family friend Mickey Herskowitz, then Governor George Bush stated, "One of the keys to being seen as a great leader is to be seen as commander-in-chief. My father had all this political capital built up when he drove the Iraqis out of Kuwait, and he wasted it. If I have a chance to invade, if I had that much capital, I'm not going to waste it. I'm going to get everything passed that I want to get passed, and I'm going to have a successful presidency," end quote.
So that was George W. Bush pointing out that there's a strategy here. Republicans have been doing this since Reagan and Grenada. Have a little war, and, you get reelected. And so, we have to remember that this is the starting point for this. So then, but back to the first and second invasions of Iraq in 91 and in 2003. In both cases, Saddam Hussein was throwing Scud missiles at us. Remember that? We were watching Scud missiles on CNN. Oh, look there goes another one. And one of the things that we were watching was our surface-to-air anti-missile missiles taking them out of the sky. We've got, there's, the Israeli Iron Dome is the most famous one, but there's all these anti-missile technologies. We've sold some to Ukraine. We sell them all over the world. So why did we let 16 or 12 or whatever it was, we still don't have final numbers yet, why did we let a dozen or so missiles fired from inside Iran where we knew they were coming, right? We knew broadly something was going to happen, and I guarantee you the instant those things left the launch pad in Iran, and it was, at least a minute or two to get to wherever they got to, as soon as they were launched, our satellites and our high altitude drone surveillance equipment, whether it's the modern version of U-2s or what, it's a AWACS planes. We could see the heat signature. We could immediately calculate the trajectory. We knew where these missiles were going. We knew how long it was going to take to get there. On top of that, well, let me just pause that right there. So why didn't we shoot them out of the sky? What we saw last night was very well choreographed, very elegant kabuki theater. Right, this was a dance that was done between Iran, Iraq, and the United States. Trump kills Soleimani. The entire world just backs away. He was half expecting, I believe he was expecting that the allies would come in and say, oh yeah, just like with George Bush, we'll fight against the Iranians with you. And no. The rest of the world, even Boris Johnson is, after his initial statement that Israel stands with the United States, immediately we were hearing out of the Prime Minister's office and Netanyahu's office that this is Trump's attack. This is not Israel's attack. This is Trump's attack. So why didn't we shoot down those missiles? Because at that point, the U.S. military, now I don't know if Trump figured this out, but certainly the Pentagon had, and maybe Pompeo had, that we've got no allies anymore. Trump has just pissed away our allies. He's destroyed our alliances. And this is go it alone. Nobody was willing to sign up for World War III. So what got said to Trump was, in my opinion, probably by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, maybe by that Marine Corps general who wrote the letter to Iraq saying, okay, we'll pull out. I believe it was General Milley, as I recall. Basically, somebody said to Trump, okay, here's the deal. You blew it when you assassinated Soleimani. That was stupid. You're going to have to pay a price for that. We're going to make it look like, we're going to make it happen in a way that you can save face. Iran is going to fire some missiles, and they're not going to hit anything. They're not going to hurt anybody. We're going to have plenty of advance notice. And Iran is going to fire these missiles, and we're going to put all of our soldiers in safe places so that nothing happens. We're going to hold our breath, and and this is going to let the Ayatollah and President Rouhani, Ayatollah Khamenei, it's going to allow them to say to the Iranian people, see, we fought back. And in fact, they're claiming that they killed 30 or 40 U.S. civilians or U.S. soldiers rather, and wounded another 70 or 80. The Iranian press has made various claims, but they're all kind of in that neighborhood. So, which would be like a proportionate response, because when Trump killed Soleimani, he didn't just kill him. He also killed the head of the Shiite paramilitary forces in Iraq that are sanctioned by the government of Iraq. In other words, that are the government of Iraq is okay with. And he killed, half a dozen other people who were traveling with them in their convoys. So this was designed to let the leadership of Iran save face and to let Donald Trump save face and to de-escalate it. And I can virtually guarantee you that did not come from Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, or Donald Trump. In all probability, that came from Mr. Esper, our Secretary of Defense, or from the Joint Chiefs, or from the President of Iraq, or, it wouldn't surprise me at all, from President Rouhani of Iran, who's actually a fairly moderate guy for the region. So that's kind of all right. So now I understand why, there were no missiles shooting missiles out of the air, because, if they shot a bunch of missiles at us and we blew up their missiles before they hit the ground, then the Iranian people would be saying, whoa, wait a minute, we want to strike somebody. And they'd have to do it all over again. So we let it happen. Now, that all sounds like really great news, right? Smart people got together and figured out a way to fix Trump's screw-up. But there's still a few loose ends. And these are really important loose ends. The first is Donald Trump assassinated Soleimani illegally. The War Powers Act and even the authorization to use military force, the AUMF after 9/11, specify that if if the President of the United States is going to engage in military action against a representative or member of a foreign government, they first have to obtain the approval of Congress or at least notify Congress. First, Trump did not do that. And secondly, if they do it without notifying Congress, the one loophole in both of those laws that allows the president to just pull the trigger is if there's imminence. In other words, it's going to happen at any minute. There's going to be major destruction to U.S. facilities or U.S. persons, and so the president has to act to protect U.S. interests. Doesn't have time to talk to Congress. And that was the original claim that Mike Pompeo made. And he obviously lied because he walked it back. So now it's like, from the American point of view, I want to know what the damn intelligence was. Mark Pocan, Congressman Pocan this morning said he went into the SCIF, the secure area, and he read the 2-page report that the Trump administration provided to Congress saying, here's why we had to strike, when we had to strike. And he suggested, I don't want to quote him, I don't have his exact words in front of me, and I don't want to get him in trouble because, you can't reveal classified information. But what he did say was that he saw nothing in that report that suggested that there was an imminent attack coming, which means that Trump broke the law. And we've seen other members of Congress who went into the SCIF and read this who are now openly calling for that to be declassified. And so that the American people we can all see that what Trump did was illegal, in addition to stupid. Number one. That's loose thread number one. And I could see that even turning into an article of impeachment. And loose thread number two is that Soleimani, he was a brilliant tactician. What this guy did over the course of 20 years is, Iran, big country, 8th largest military in the world, but one of the most effective ways to build, to have military power in a region like the Middle East, instead of having all kinds of weapons and armies, is you have proxies. They funded Hezbollah in Lebanon, fragments of it in Israel. They've got, their people in Yemen. They've got their people in Syria. They've got their people in Iraq. And Soleimani was controlling all these groups. And he could turn them he could weaponize them. Well, the question now is, without him there, he had the power to release them, to unleash them. He also had the power to constrain them. Without him there any longer, does his number two have the kind of personal, moral, political, knows where the bodies are buried, whatever it takes, authority to prevent the groups that Soleimani put together all across the Middle East from, over the course of the next few days or weeks or months or even year, initiating all kinds of asymmetrical, non-normal attacks against American interests? And I guess the third question would be, was the threat against Trump's property something that caused him to change?
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So there's a lot there. I'll share a little bit more with that on the other side of the break, and we'll pick up your calls. A lot going on here. Stick around. And welcome back. Eddie in Agra, Kansas, watching us on YouTube. Hey, Eddie, what's up?
Well, I wondered, I thought all along since this happened that this was just a dance between the two things to rally the Iranians but especially, I wonder if you don't think that this is a thing for Trump to stay in power and to dodge impeachment.
Well, if he can avoid it becoming obvious that his action taking out Soleimani in the first place was stupid. If Trump can avoid that, if he can, right now about 40, I think the last poll I saw, which was last night, was that 47% of Americans think it was a good thing to take this guy out, okay? So if he can get that number up to 50 or 60 or 70%, then Trump wins from this. And Ayatollah Khamenei and President Rouhani, if they can keep the Iranian people convinced that they actually did, kick us in the shins or draw some blood, punch us in the nose and draw some blood, they will come out of this stronger, and it will have been a good PR effort on both sides, and the price will have been fairly low, outside of the death of Soleimani, which was apparently a body blow to Iran. Am I answering your question, Eddie?
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%. I would like if you give me a chance to throw out two more things. One, isn't it interesting how the Republicans have shifted their stance from supporting rights and morals and being the party that helped the people to didn't all this start when they stopped enforcing the laws against the big companies. We had the broke down
the Sherman Antitrust Act.
Companies.
Yeah, when Reagan stopped enforcing the Sherman Act in 1982. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. When all of a sudden there's no laws to stop the big farms, the big government, and all of a sudden we became more. We started making the ultra rich richer. So that Donald Trump could be the super billionaire, and then all of a sudden the Republicans, they start talking about it's all about how rich everybody is, and they don't care about the middle class and the poor.
Yeah, and that goes back to the Supreme Court as well. Back in the 70s, Robert Bork was promoting this idea that that when the antitrust laws were written, the goal of them was to keep prices low for consumers, which of course is complete BS. It was not the case at all. The goal of the antitrust laws was to protect communities, to protect small businesses, to protect local business, to protect employees, to protect customers, to protect the institution of the company itself, to protect the shareholders, and to protect consumers. But Bork started selling this thing, and in somewhere in the mid-'70s, I think it was 74 or 77, it's in a book that I've got that'll be coming out this fall. The Supreme Court, in a case called GTE Sylvania, adopted Robert Bork's theory and combined that with Reagan saying he wasn't going to enforce the Sherman Act anymore. And that was basically the end of representative democracy in the United States and of an economic system that benefited average working people. And that led us right into the 80s, right into trickle-down economics, right into Reaganomics, where the only people who do well, and their pay is up over 300%, since 1980, are the top 1%. And everybody else, their pay has gone down, and they're everything. So yeah, you've identified it, Eddie. Eddie, thanks a lot for the call. We'll be right back. It's 22 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Occupying the media 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, right here. Stick around. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
So weird out there. Anyhow, you can check out all the details of it in our little video over at thomhartmann.com. And thanks again for supporting the program. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. So, I basically shared that riff with you, and obviously what happened is that Iran notified Iraq that they were going to strike in these two locations at this specific time. Iraq notified us. We moved all our soldiers into safety, and we did not launch a defensive anti-ballistic missile shield. We did not put planes in the air. We did not, specific to this, we didn't put missiles in the air. We didn't have, anti-missile batteries. None of that. Because we knew in advance that this was just going to be a dance. And Trump is out now saying, oh, and we're going to have new sanctions on Iraq. We'll see. I'm wondering if he has, or at least his advisors around him have now that they've danced up to the edge, did they have their Cuban Missile moment? Did they have their staring into the abyss moment? If so, might be a good thing. Might be that they're chastened. Might be that they're, that Trump and Pompeo and Pence and these guys are starting to think, maybe there's something to that strategy that President Obama had of keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. Let's bring in Iran. Let's work together with them, with the JCPOA. But then, in his speech, he can't help but attack President Obama because, oh my God, how dare a black guy be president of the United States and do something good? In my opinion, that is what is animating at least 90% of Donald Trump's animus against Obama, because he doesn't pick on other presidents. He doesn't say, well, Clinton did this or, Bush did that. He doesn't even pick on other Democratic presidents. It's all Obama. He spent 8 years claiming that Obama wasn't entitled to be president because, it's not possible that a black guy could just get there on his own 2 feet, on his own competence, on his own brilliance. There must have been an international conspiracy to take a little baby born in Kenya and move him to Hawaii so that he could someday become president. So, anyway, we'll see. But on the other hand, what is going to happen if the people who are still loyal to Soleimani, the guys that he trained, the guys that he led, I mean, he was the George Washington's probably too strong a thing, but throughout the military and throughout the paramilitaries associated with Iran, his name was really, really well known. And will the government of Iran be able to restrain those guys?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And if not, what's going to happen when a Benghazi-type situation happens and Donald Trump is president? Our book today is How to Get Rid of a President by David Priess. And this is from the chapter Rejected by the Party, starting on page 12, kind of mid-chapter. Presidents need not be thrown out at the polls on election day to find themselves dislodged from the White House. History shows us that a chief executive's own political allies can remove that incumbent when they perceive him as unpopular or unfit. Refusing to nominate a president for a second term, or better yet, getting the incumbent to realize that he should walk away before it becomes an embarrassing vote at the convention, does bring the party significant pain. But many politicians have calculated that discarding their own party's toxic president by internal action is better than waiting for the voters to do it. This dynamic remained absent for the first half century or so of American politics. George Washington, who didn't represent any formal party, set a precedent by stepping away from re-election after 2 terms. Successor after successor followed suit, keeping the support of their parties until they left office after 8 years. Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Jackson lost the next election, both Adamses and Van Buren, or met the Grim Reaper, Harrison. John Tyler, if only in this one respect, was a trendsetter. He began a 6-president cascade of men who failed to appear on their party's ballot in the general election after their first term. One, Zachary Taylor, literally had no choice. Like Harrison, he died in office. The others, by staying alive through their 4-year terms, could have carried their party's banners again on Election Day. Not one did, as national agonizing over slavery and other tensions within each of the major parties made it difficult for any president to build and sustain a governing coalition. Of those 5 chief executives, only James Polk left with a solid reputation and a ledger of successes. He'd told Democrats upon his nomination in 1844, "I shall enter upon the discharge of the high and solemn duties of the office with the settled purpose of not being a candidate for re-election." And he stayed true to his word. It was just as well. Only 3 months after what would have been his second inauguration, he died at the age of 53. The 3 presidents who followed Polk, the forgettable series of Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan, shared 3 characteristics. First, historians routinely rank them among the nation's worst presidents. Second, and related to that, they took no responsibility for resolving the national moral failure of slavery. And third, no matter how they had attained office, they, like future presidents Chester Arthur and Lyndon Johnson, found themselves spurned by their own parties. The Whigs had learned in 1840 that a celebrity candidate seemed to have an easier route into the White House than a party regular. So in 1848, they nominated General Zachary Taylor, a recent hero of battlefields in the Mexican-American War. Despite his lack of solid political principles or any apparent passion for the job, just 2 years earlier, he'd said with apparent sincerity, "I am not and never shall be an aspirant for that honor." Taylor won the election over Democratic candidate Lewis Cass. In July 1850, he became the second straight Whig general to president who couldn't make it to the next election alive. Vice President Millard Fillmore took his place. Fillmore had risen to prominence in New York's anti-Mason party dedicated to exposing and opposing Freemason fraternal organizations, but switched allegiance to the Whigs in the 1830s. In the first year and a half of the administration, inter-party rivals had manipulated Taylor better than Fillmore did, leaving him little to do but preside over the Senate and stew over his fate in a useless job. But as president, he was prepared to avenge perceived slights. Ahead of their expected dismissal, all the cabinet members whom Fillard had inherited from Taylor offered their resignations, which were quickly accepted by the new president. He asked them to remain in place for 1 month. They agreed to stay for 1 week. Fillmore would proceed to fire more previous political appointees than any of his successors had. More than half of those at the State Department, for example, had to find new jobs. The biggest development during Fillmore's presidency was the Compromise of 1850. This set of bills admitted California to the Union as a free state, allowed the organization of the Utah and New Mexico territories without reference to slavery, resolved both the Texas state boundary and the Lone Star State's remaining debt, abolished the slave trade in the District of Columbia, and reaffirmed the fugitive slave law that required the returning of slaves escaped across state lines. Fillmore signed each bill, believing this package of measures had fixed what he considered an annoying issue that kept getting in the way of his other priorities. The compromise bills delayed a war between the states, but at a cost. They not only perpetuated slavery, but split the Whigs further apart, as most Northerners refused to abide by the fugitive slave law. Congressional elections in November 1850 increased the Democratic opposition's majorities in both the House and the Senate. The rest of the president's term was so bad that the highlight might have been the start of Commodore Matthew Perry's voyage to Japan to open that country to American trade, even though he didn't arrive until Fillmore left office. Not long after rising to become the chief executive, Fillmore declared he wouldn't run again in the 1852 election. He reiterated that in 1851. But the trappings of presidential power and the pleas of his remaining party faithful convinced him to retract that pledge and make a late entry into the field of candidates. He portrayed his about face as a noble personal sacrifice for the good of the party and the country. And during the spring of that election year, 8 Whig state conventions endorsed him. As delegates gathered for what a leading historian of the era calls the longest, most rancorous, and most debilitating Whig National Convention ever to meet, the first tally had Fillmore in the lead. How to Get Rid of a President. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The hidden history of the Supreme Court and the betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Hartmann.com. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you and Robert in Mills, Wyoming. Hey, Robert, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Good to talk to you again. I finally got DirecTV back, so I can see again.
Cool.
So what I want to talk about, Tom, is talking about the legality of this war that we've been in for 17 years
right.
plus. The whole thing is illegal. Even though I supported President Obama with the bombing of ISIS, 2,800 sorties. He's supposed to be a weak president. Well, you bomb a country, 2,800 missions. I think that's doing a pretty good job. But where was congressional authority here? In other words, what I'm saying, this whole thing goes back to George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush and the illegal invasion. I see no declaration of war.
Yep.
None whatsoever. Nobody talks to Congress. And, of course, if you call your congressman, or in my case, congresswoman, the offspring of Mr. Cheney, you get no answers. And, no, you don't. You really don't, Tom.
Yeah.
Of course, she's happier than a pig in a poke that we're dropping bombs all over the place. And I called up Senator Engie's office, and he doesn't have a statement yet. Of course, thank God he's not running again. And it's a funny thing, Tom, that when I brought up that the idea, of we have to defend Israel, if I hear that one more time, I'm going to scream. There's a country, I brought it up, the young lady that's working in the office, that Israel, back in 1967, defeated 6 countries in 6 days and defeated one country in 6 hours.
Right.
And she didn't know about it. And I'm thinking, well,
this is Mike Enzie's office?
You didn't hear about the 6-day war? She said no. Or maybe I don't remember. How can you...
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying, Tom? I mean, what are you teaching
I get
in
it,
these schools?
but Israel is a democracy and it is an alliance or an ally. But using Israel as an excuse for everything is not fair to Israel to begin with. Not to mention, just lousy politics. It seems to me that the reason why we're in the Middle East is, and that this just as easily could have been, the Caribbean. When Margaret Thatcher had her little war with the Argentinians over the Falklands, that took her popularity. She was in the tank because she had just busted the coal miners union and the people in the UK, and she was talking about privatizing the National Health Service, and she was privatizing the railroads, and people were seriously upset with her.
Correct.
And she had her little war with the Falklands, and boom, her popularity went above 70% suddenly.
Yeah, I remember that.
And Reagan looks at that and goes, well, I can do that. And so he has this little war with Grenada to get himself reelected in '84. And then George Herbert Walker Bush says, well, okay, I've got to have a little war. And so April Gillespie, Saddam Hussein had been agitating for some time. He was really upset that Kuwait was slant drilling under the border and sucking oil out of the pools of oil underneath Iraq, illegally. But instead of going to the United Nations, he comes to the Bush administration and says, Kuwait used to be our 47th district or whatever it was called. It used to be a state of ours.
19th province.
19th province. Thank you very much, Robert. And we would like it back. We're going to take it back. What do you think? And April Gillespie, April Gillespie was on this program, to her credit. And April Gillespie was like, that's your business. It's not our business. And so Saddam goes into Kuwait and says, okay, guys, you're stealing our oil. We're going to stop that. And then we get the daughter of the Prince of Kuwait, or the King of Kuwait, or whatever, the Emir of Kuwait, pretending that she's a nurse, testifying before Congress that the evil Iraqi soldiers are taking babies out of incubators and throwing the babies on the floor and stealing the incubators. It was a complete lie. It was totally manufactured. But that gave George Herbert Walker Bush the excuse to invade Iraq with his 100-hour war. And then, Tom, following that, we had all these sanctions.
All these wars, Tom, been manufactured going back to Vietnam.
That's my point. Going back to remember the Maine, in 1898 or 1899, whatever the Spanish-American War, whenever that happened.
That's right. Tom, they could be telling the truth, and I don't believe them anymore.
Yeah.
And I've been a Republican for years. In fact, I voted for Trump because, remember, the endless wars.
Yes.
Remember, Tom?
Oh,
the endless wars?
I do, and a lot of people did vote for him.
I'm getting you out of there. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
And then I see 3,000 troops going to that desert out there, which was a manufactured country to begin with Sykes-Picot.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
the bottom line here is, Robert, that the reason why we're in the Middle East right now is because George Herbert Walker Bush decided he was going to have a little war just like Reagan did. That little war turned, there was a remnant left over from that. Bill Clinton kept that going with the sanctions to be a tough guy, right? Nobody wants to be the one who gives into Saddam Hussein. And then George W. Bush came along and said, okay, now they're weakened to the point that we can easily overthrow the regime. Let's come up with some BS excuse, and him and Cheney cooked the intelligence. This is a series of Republican wars that are completely unnecessary. Robert, I got to move along, but thank you. You nailed it. And what's astonishing to me is how completely amnesiac our media is, particularly our television media, about the origins of all this stuff. Where this started. This started with Reagan and Bush Sr., and, carries on to this day. So, anyway, Maverick in Edmonds, Washington. Hey, Maverick, what's up?
Tom, you book writing machine, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. What's on your mind?
Even my cat's impressed with how many books you've written, and my cat doesn't impress easily, let me tell you.
Thank you.
So just a couple of things. I tried to call in yesterday, but wasn't able to get through. You mentioned something about us targeting other high-ranking officials, and it was coincidentally, it was in yesterday's paper. This is from Bloomberg News. I'm reading it from the Seattle Times. 1943, we shot down Japanese Admiral Yamamoto, who was the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. I'm not correcting you. I just thought that, for your edification. But then you mentioned yesterday that you weren't sure how many troops we had.
But that was actually during a war. Well, yeah, okay. Yeah, that does contradict my point yesterday. Okay, continue, Maverick. I'm sorry.
I'm just trying to contribute, Tom. So U.S. bases and forces in the Middle East, and this is from Tribune Media Service, Tribune News Service, and I'll just go real quick. Turkey 2,500, Syria 800, Iraq 6,000, Jordan 3,000, Israel 40, Saudi Arabia 3,000, Qatar 13,000, Bahrain 7,000, Kuwait 13,000, Afghanistan 14,000.
Yeah, it all adds up to about 50 grand, right? 50,000 troops.
Yeah. And I was pretty sure that you didn't have a count there, and it just happened to show up while I was listening to your show. It was in the paper, so there you have it, sir.
Okay. Well, thank you, Maverick. And this is, these are the people that we have put in the front lines in order to help George Herbert Walker Bush get reelected, which didn't even work out. And in order to get George W. Bush reelected, I played the clip earlier where he told his biographer in 1999 that if he got elected, he was going to have a war with Iraq that was going to last all the way up to 2004 so that he would get reelected in 2004. And sure enough, that's exactly what he did.
That's absolutely unbelievable. And I wrote a letter to the editor of the Seattle Times yesterday, just 2 sentences, and I'll share it with you. Iran's response is on Trump, not left, not right, just anti-stupid.
Yeah, there you go. Maverick, thank you very much. Ree in Nampa, Idaho. Hey, Ree, what's up?
Hi. Oh, I'm honored to talk to you, Tom. I've been concerned about something. I'm so glad I had a chance to talk to somebody who might know something about these gold stars that are putting on IDs.
Right. This is the real. It's called the Real ID Law, and it's an extension of the Patriot Act and the legislation that was passed after 9/11.
They're concerned about citizenship.
Well, yeah. The idea was the sales pitch for it was that the idea was that we want to make sure when people are going through airports and things like that, that the ID they're using actually attests to their being United States citizens. And there were a number of states that were opposed to this, mostly states that were trying to protect privacy rights. Here in Oregon, for example, my driver's license does not have a star on it. The state has not yet started doing this. We don't comply with the Real ID Act yet. So there's going to be a huge crush next year of people wanting to get new driver's licenses because this goes into effect in October of 2020, of this year, October of this year.
Don't they have to have birth certificates?
Yes, it means when you apply for a driver's license, you have to jump through the same hoops that currently you have to jump through in order to get a passport. You have to prove your citizenship.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Well, when I heard that, the first thing that came to my mind, literally, the first thing that came to my mind was the gold star and Nazis,
No, I think for the Republicans it was a twofer. It makes it harder to get a driver's license, and so people who might think about getting a driver's license to vote are not, who live in inner cities and just never drive and don't need to have a driver's license, or or students who are going to college, and it makes it harder to get a driver's license, and in a state with the voter ID laws, that makes it harder to vote. And so the Republicans were gung ho for this, and the Democrats were not willing to say, well, we're not in favor of national security. So I think that's what's going on there, Ree. But it's called the Real ID Act, and it goes into effect in October of this year, and you got to have the gold star means that your state is certifying that somebody actually checked that you actually are a citizen of the United States. Ree, thanks a lot for the call. We'll be back. It's 46 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. More of the news of the day and your calls right after this.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Boy, it's amazing. They're running ads on TV for Medicare Advantage, and it's not even inside the sign-up period. So this is just for new people. It must be very profitable. And welcome back, Tim in Los Angeles. Hey, Tim, thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's on your mind?
Oh, hi, Tom. I've been thinking outside the box, which I recommend everybody to do in these times. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I've been worried about a possible coup conspiracy concerning Trump. It's almost like, to me, that he's purposely getting himself impeached. A human being doesn't make that many big mistakes in 2 months.
I don't think it's that, Tim. I think that this guy had to commit a bunch of crimes to get where he is. He had to commit a bunch of crimes to get as rich as he claims to be, and then he had to commit a bunch of crimes to become the Republican nominee, including, paying off Stormy Daniels. And then he had to commit a bunch of crimes in order to become president, including sucking up to foreign governments. And so it shouldn't surprise us that he continues to engage in criminal activity, and occasionally he gets caught.
It's all because of the corporate media. I mean, they own the media, so of course people are being informed. It's not in their interest to inform us. So anyway, I stick to alternatives.
Yeah, well, they played a very dangerous game in 2002, and the president of CBS News he just came right out and said it. He said, this may be a terrible thing, Donald Trump, for America, maybe a terrible thing for America, but it sure is great for CBS. And please, Mr. Trump, keep it up. And They thought that they could play chicken. They thought that they could get Trump up to the point where they'd have a nice horse race and there'd be a lot of suspense and a lot of tension and everybody would watch and they'd make a lot of money selling advertising, but it wouldn't push us over into becoming a fascistic autocracy. And guess what? They blew it.
But, right a week before they voted impeachment, all of Trump's guys were like all over the world, meeting with like dictators, God knows who, and all over the world, and then he starts this whole thing of assassinating the other, I forget
Soleimani. Yeah,
and it's just outrageous. He's making himself a true villain. He's not giving.
Well, Trump assassinated Soleimani because he thought he had successfully assassinated al-Baghdadi just a month or so ago, and it earned him nothing but praise. Right across the board. Democrats praised him, Republicans praised him, the press praised him, and he thought, oh, this is cool. If I kill bad guys, I get applauded. And so he thought that when he killed Soleimani that he was going to get applauded. And instead, everybody was like, oh, wait a minute, this is not apples and oranges. This guy isn't some weird terrorist running a little group of, a little cell that has nothing to do with the government. This guy is the number 3 official in Iran.
Oh,
sorry?
It's definitely just off the wall. It's off the wall.
Trump is completely off the wall, Tim, and I agree with you, and this is what we have, and we'll see if there is going to be any testimony before the Senate, which is a whole other issue that we haven't really talked much about today. In fact, I'll get into that right after the break. It's coming up on 10 minutes before the hour. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and picking up your phone calls. Randy in, hang on just a second. There we go. Randy in Sacramento. Hey, Randy, what's on your mind today?
How are you? I'm doing well. Hey, I had a question. This is a legal question. Here in Sacramento County, we're doing everything we can to help people vote here, especially with persons with disabilities. Mm-hmm. Now, we know part of the voter suppression efforts that they had in southern states was that they would not let them have places to sit down, and they would not let them have water, and they moved polling places. Isn't there something we could do about this through the Americans with Disabilities Act, especially under Title II and programs and access?
Yes and no. That was one of the main rationales for voting machines in the first place. And that they were designed to be accessible to disabled people as well as non-disabled people, and but I think you would have a hard time. Yeah, I mean, if you were disabled, you can go to the front of the line. So you would have a hard time arguing that disabled people are being disadvantaged because Ohio has said that in largely Democratic areas or largely Black or Hispanic areas, they're only going to provision the polling places with half as many voting machines as they had the previous year. So people are going to have to wait in line 10 hours to vote. I mean, that's exactly what happened in Ohio in 2004. But if you showed up in a wheelchair, or you could demonstrate disability, you could jump the line. So I don't think that that's the magic bullet that we can use. The magic bullet, Randy, is to have an absolute right to vote written into law and into the Constitution. The Constitution does not provide a right to vote because at the time of the founding of this republic, there was an entire class of people that nobody wanted voting. North, south, right across the board. Nobody wanted women, or nobody. The power structure, the male power structure, did not want women voting. And whether they were black women, white women, you name it, no women voting. And then it kept it that way until 1920. And so the right to vote is not in the Constitution. We need to put the right to vote in the Constitution. And if you have a right to vote, rather than simply the privilege to vote, then when somebody interrupts that right or throws impediments in the way of that right, like forcing you to stand in line for 10 hours to vote, then you have the reasonable basis for a lawsuit that could change things. So, Randy, thanks a lot for the call. Dave in Federal Way, Washington. Hey, Dave, what's up?
Hey, not too much, Tom. Hey, I just wanted to mention real quick that, right after Soleimani was killed, there was a strike by al-Shabaab militants on the Manda airfield right outside of Camp Simba in Kenya. Now, people will say, and this is just a pill I got to swallow, because I live in America. Forget the fact that I did this for 25 years, intelligence work. They'll say, "Oh, come on, Dave, don't be stupid. Al-Shabaab is, they're Sunni-oriented. They're affiliated with Al-Qaeda.
Well, they are.
Al-Qaeda hates Iran." Yes, they are, but let me tell you how they're connected, okay? Now, we put 2 B-52s in Diego Garcia. That's the Indian Ocean, okay? More than likely, the al-Shabaab militants probably saw an increase of activity related to what the machinations that's going on in Iran and Iraq. Mm-hmm. They probably saw an increase in military activity around the Manda airstrip, all right, which is outside of Camp Simba, and they took advantage. See, this is why it gets all confusing between Sunni and Shia. All right, and you have Republicans that say, look, they're all the same. They're just Muslims, okay? They're all the same. And then you have liberals, thoughtful liberals that say, no, now wait a minute, okay? They've been at war for thousands of years. These people are not, kissing cousins.
Now, wait a second, Dave. You also have Republicans like Donald Trump who are, and Jared Kushner, who are saying they're not all the same. We're throwing in with the Sunnis, with the Emiratis and the Saudis, and aligning that with the right-wing government in Israel against the Shiites specifically.
Right, and I can make this real simple, okay, to where no one has to be insulted and we can all kind of understand it. Now, what does the regime in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, Khalid bin Salman and Mohammed bin Salman, what do the regime in Tehran by Khomeini and Donald Trump and Republicans, what do they all have in common? They all, they have a serious disdain for impudence. And impudence and impertinence towards the wealthy and the powerful. Like, in other words, Thom Hartmann is very impudent, questioning the motives of the oligarchs and everything. See, and if you were an Iranian citizen list as well, right, or in Saudi Arabia,
or if I was a Saudi citizen,
then you would probably be on. Yeah, they do not like this. They do not like it. And this is where the strange bedfellows sort of emerge, okay? And this is where you have, like, Saudi Arabia just recently paid big-time money to extricate a couple of spies, right? I mean, that was so brazen. I couldn't believe Saudi Arabia did that. They never did that before. They straight up paid and, extracted 2 spies they had working. Well, where were they working? Social media. They were working at YouTube or whatever to monitor Saudi dissidents. All right, They were ratting on Saudi.
I remember that story. Yeah.
Yep. Have a good one, Tom.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dave. Yeah. It's just to add a little more flavor to the soup here. Boy, we really do live in interesting times. On the other side of this break, David Ritter is going to drop by from Australia to talk about the fires there, and then we'll continue our conversation about politics and war and peace.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Our book in today's Thom Hartmann Book Club is On Fire, The Burning Case for a Green New Deal by Naomi Klein. This is from the epilogue, the very end of the book, and it's titled The Capsule Case for a Green New Deal. Critics of the Green New Deal have plenty of serious arguments for why all this is doomed. Political paralysis in Washington is real. Even in a world where climate change denying Republicans were swept out of power, there would still be plenty of centrist Democrats convinced that their constituents had no appetite for radical change. The plans are expensive, and getting the budgets approved will be a Herculean effort. A better course of action, we hear, would be to advance climate policies that appeal to many on the right, like a shift from coal to nuclear power, or a small tax on carbon that returns the revenues as a dividend to every citizen. The main trouble with these incremental approaches is that they simply won't get the job done. In order to win support from Republicans soaked in fossil fuel money, the price on carbon would be too low to make much of an impact. Nuclear power is expensive and slow to roll out compared with renewables, and that's not to mention the risks associated with uranium mining and waste storage. The truth is we cannot lower emissions as steeply and as rapidly as required to swerve off our perilous trajectory without a sweeping industrial and infrastructure overhaul. The good news is that the Green New Deal isn't nearly as impractical or unrealistic as its many critics claim. I made the case for why that is throughout the book, but what follows are 9 more reasons the Green New Deal has a fighting chance, a chance that will increase every time we go out and make the case. 1, it will be a massive job creator. Every part of the world that has invested heavily in renewables and in efficiency has found these sectors to be much more powerful job creators than fossil fuels. When New York State made a commitment to get half its energy from renewables by 2030, it immediately saw a spike in job creation. The accelerated timeline of the U.S. Green New Deal will turn it into a jobs machine. Even without federal support, indeed with active sabotage from the White House, the green economy is already creating more jobs than oil and gas. According to the 2018 U.S. Energy and Employment Review, jobs in wind, solar energy efficiency, and other clean energy sectors outnumbered fossil fuels by a rate of 3 to 1. This is happening because of a combination of state and municipal incentives and the plummeting costs of renewables. A Green New Deal would take the industry supernova while ensuring that the jobs have salaries and benefits comparable to those offered in the oil and gas sector. There's no shortage of research to support this. For instance, a 2019 study on the job impacts of a Green New Deal style program in the state of Colorado found that many more jobs would be created than lost. The study, published by the Department of Economics and Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, looked at what it would take for the state to achieve a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. It found that roughly 585 non-management jobs would be lost, but that with an investment of $14.5 billion a year in clean energy, quote, Colorado will generate about 100,000 jobs per year in the state. There are many more studies with similarly striking findings. A plan put forward by the U.S. Blue-Green Alliance, a body that brings together unions and environmentalists, estimated that a $40 billion annual investment in public transit and high-speed rail for 6 years would produce more than 3.5 million jobs during that period. And according to a report from the European Transport Workers Federation, comprehensive policies to reduce emissions in the transport sector by 80% would create 7 million new jobs across that continent, while another 5 million clean energy jobs in Europe would slash electricity emissions by 90%. Number 2, paying for it will create a fairer economy. As the 2018 IPCC report on keeping warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius made clear, if we don't take transformative action to lower emissions, the cost will be astronomical. The panel's estimate is that the economic damages of allowing temperatures to increase by 2 degrees Celsius, as opposed to 1.5, would hit $69 trillion globally. Of course, rolling out a Green New Deal would have large costs as well, and the plan's advocates have pointed to a variety of ways this can be financed. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has said that the U.S. version should be financed the way any previous emergency spending has been, by the U.S. Congress simply authorizing the funds, backstopped by the Treasury, the world's currency of last resort. According to New Consensus, the think tank closely associated with their policy proposals, because, quote, the Green New Deal will produce new goods and services to keep pace with and absorb new expenditures, there is no more reason to let fear about financing halt progress than there was to let it halt wars or tax cuts, end quote. The European Spring proposal for a Green New Deal, meanwhile, calls for a global minimum corporate tax rate to capture the tax revenue that the Apples and Googles of the world currently dodge with transnational schemes. It also calls for a reversal of monetary orthodoxy, with public investment floating green bonds supported by central banks. Quote, to address the true existential threat that we face today, we must reverse the economic policies that brought us to this brink. Austerity means extinction, end quote. Some analysts like Christian Parenti have emphasized that federal governments can drive the transition with their purchasing policies. In short, there are all kinds of ways to raise financing, including ways that attack untenable levels of wealth concentration and shift the burden to those most responsible for climate pollution. And it's not hard to figure out who that is. We know, thanks to research from the Climate Accountability Institute, that a whopping 71% of greenhouse gas emissions since 1988 can be traced to just 100 corporations. On Fire by Naomi Klein.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. On the line with us is David Ritter, the CEO of Greenpeace Australia Pacific, the author of his latest book, the Coal, C-O-A-L, Coal Truth. Greenpeace.org.au is the website, and you can tweet him at David_Ritter, R-I-T-T-E-R. David, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Tom.
And thank you for joining us from Australia. I'm seeing these photographs of the fires that are going on in your country and on your continent, which is roughly the same size as the continental United States. And it seems apocalyptic. What's the current status of the fires?
Well, the fires are still burning, and I have to say it is a very sad time to be an Australian. Our fire season normally, before global warming, started or was conventionally thought to start in December and to run through the summer months of December, January, February. The fires this season started in September, so much earlier than they should have. And they've now burned through an area of around 8.5 million hectares, which, to give some idea, is bigger than Scotland. There are fires still burning in every Australian state. There are 6 Australian states. And the fires themselves, in addition to just destroying vast areas of our country, have also bathed our eastern cities in toxic smoke. So Melbourne and Sydney, cities famous for their blue skies, have been bathed in the kind of toxic smoke that Australians are not used to, and have made our cities during this period at times some of the most polluted in the world.
Now, I understand that on the ecological side of this, the best estimates are about 1 billion animals, including a number of potentially or endangered species, or what may be as a consequence of these fires, endangered species, have died. It almost seems like there should be a disturbance in the force when 1 billion sentient beings vanish from the earth or are burned up. And also, I was over at Media Matters earlier today, and the headline is, amid raging fires, Rupert Murdoch's Australian media empire turns a blind eye to climate crisis. A, you want to speak to the ecology of that, and B, what is happening in your country with regard to the media and the politics of this?
Yeah, the impact on our ecology is truly dreadful. Australia is one of the 17 megadiverse countries in terms of its plants and animals in the world. And that's best known internationally, I suppose, through some of our iconic animals, the kangaroos and koalas and so on. What's happened through the fires has been described as by one scientist as a bit of a biological Armageddon, because large areas of biodiverse region have simply been destroyed. And our plants and animals are already under great strain in this country. Sadly, in recent years, we just do not have a great record in protecting our flora and fauna. And so animals that were already endangered or critically endangered or vulnerable have been pushed to the brink and may in fact end up as extinct as a consequence of the fires. Because you say when you kill 1 billion or 500 million, the numbers are necessarily estimates of creatures, that has a terrible, terrible impact on their viability as species. But when you use language like viability of species, it can lose that visceral impact that just seeing the images of charred animal bodies burned alive, of terribly badly injured animals by fire. Those images, along with those of families grieving for the 25 lives lost so far, along with images of children grieving for their homes lost or just fleeing as refugees in their own country, those images are now seared onto Australian minds. And as you point out, it is obscene in this context that we have seen many, many years of systematic denial of the reality of global warming, of the climate emergency by the Murdoch-owned newspapers in Australia. And there are a number of states where the only significant paper is owned by News Limited, and the influence of the Murdoch press is significant. And it's not merely a systematic editorial pattern of playing down the climate emergency and its consequences. It's also the perpetual featuring of opinion writers who advance the most sort of outlandish theories about that run contrary to all the accepted and reputable science. So it really has been this systematic pattern of denial, of downplaying, and in the context of this country that has been on fire, it is just particularly abhorrent.
Yeah. We're talking with David Ritter, the CEO of Greenpeace Australia, greenpeace.org.au. David, what is Greenpeace doing in Australia with regard to all this? What are you all doing?
Well, we are above all, I suppose, standing with those impacted communities. Like many others in Australia, we dug deep at the end of last year to support the many communities that have been impacted by the fires. But as a campaigning organisation with a vision of an earth capable of nurturing life in all of its magnificent diversity, we've seen it as our role to do two things. One has been to scaffold the stories of survivors. So, for example, towards the end of last year, we enabled a couple whose house had been burned down in the fires to take the remains of their house to Canberra and display it outside the walls of our parliament in a very dignified and moving protest that the images of which travelled around the world. So it's that kind of scaffolding of survivors' stories. And then the other thing that we see as a crucial role in this, and remembering there are hundreds of thousands of Australians who are involved in the Greenpeace network, we see it as being crucial that we continue to draw that connection, that it is the conditions brought on by climate change that have been generative of the conditions that have made for these fires. So it's climate, it's the emissions from coal, from oil, from gas, driving the climate emergency, and the climate emergency driving the catastrophic fires. And in an Australian context, coal is the problem here. Roughly a third of our emissions, domestic emissions in Australia, come from burning coal in the coal-burning power stations, and we are one of the two largest coal exporting nations in the world. So Australia is making a really outsized contribution to the problem of the climate emergency because of our coal, oil and gas.
Here in the United States, we have what used to be two brothers. Now one of them has passed away, David Koch, and Charles, his brother, is left, whose daddy made his fortune in the fossil fuel industry, drilling for oil for Joe Stalin, and then came back to the United States and made more money with fossil fuels. And they built an empire. It's now diversified beyond fossil fuels, but Koch Industries, basically a fossil fuel company, and they have been funding and leading much of the climate denial movement, at least over the last few decades. Is there an analog to that in Australia? Somebody who is just obscenely, fabulously rich? I think the Koch brothers were the second or third richest, family in the United States, behind the Waltons and maybe Bill Gates. Is there an analog to that in Australia, where you have a coal baron or an oil baron who has so much money that he or she is just completely distorting the politics of your country?
Well, there's probably not one. There hasn't probably historically been one single analogue, and maybe I could give an answer in three parts. And the first part is that some of what has afflicted you in the US has, of course, travelled internationally, because we know that there are these links of fossil fuel interests, of climate denial that are transnational. So US climate denial is exported to Australia, and Australia exported elsewhere, and so on. So there are those transnational links. That's the first thing to say. Then the second thing to say is that probably over time in Australia, it has more been a group of interests that have acted together to block progress. They used to, more than 10 years ago, they used to jokingly describe themselves as the greenhouse mafia, because they were so proud of the way in which they had stalled progress on climate action in Australia. And that is both in terms of lobbying done from within individual companies, but also some peak industry bodies like the Minerals Council of Australia and the Business Council of Australia, which have just repeatedly and vigorously opposed decent climate action, to the point where you end up with a Prime Minister or future Prime Minister carrying a lump of varnished coal into Parliament and saying there's nothing to be scared of. Mm-hmm. And then the third part I would give to your answer is that we did see, just before the last national election in Australia, one particular person, a miner called Clive Palmer, who is reported to have spent somewhere between 50 and 60 million Australian dollars in a matter of weeks just before our just before our national election. And the impact of that money was not to get Mr. Palmer's party a single seat in either chamber of our national legislature, but he did boast afterwards, I think it's a direct boast from him, that the effect of it had been to keep the Labor Party, which is in Australia the closest analogue, I guess, we have to the US Democrats, out of office. Hmm. So there are certainly analogues to what you've experienced in the US.
Yeah, remarkable stuff. David Ritter, the CEO of Greenpeace Australia Pacific, his latest book, The Cold Truth, the website greenpeace.org.au, as in Australia. You can tweet him at David_Ritter. David, thank you for dropping by.
Thank you very much for having me on the program, Tom.
By all means, and please keep up the great work. It's, I'm a huge fan of Greenpeace, have been for years and years. We'll be right back.
Really appreciate that.
Thank you, David.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this. And welcome back. Abraham in Seattle, Washington. Hey, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I just wanted to point to another theory about this recent incident with Iran and Qasem Soleimani. So I was born and grew up in Iran and lived there for 48 years. I know how these mullahs think. And I believe this was a multi-side deal. So by this mean, they get rid of a person who was very popular, and people from all sides, they loved him. And after this, all the protests, all the anti-government protests in Iran, they are dead. And in Iraq, we had anti-U.S. protests that they flipped. Anti-Iran protests that it flipped and became anti-U.S. protests.
Right.
And at the same time, Mr. Trump made Israel and Saudi Arabia happy by killing one of their enemies.
Right. But the main consequence is that he has united Iran around its leadership when, in fact, the country seemed, at least from over here, to be on the edge of possible substantial political change. As young people were out in the streets protesting, thousands of them had been killed, thousands of them had been imprisoned by the regime. All of that is gone. There's a rally around the flag, just like we did around George W. Bush after 9/11 here. And then in Iraq, average Iraqis were starting to demand at least some semblance of independence from Iran, even though the new government's principally Sunni, or Shia, rather, excuse me. And that's gone, had been blown up, basically. So basically, Donald Trump handed both Iraq and Iran control of that entire region to the hardliners in Iran. Do I have that right, Abraham?
Correct. Yeah, and Mr. Putin is happy because there is a possibility that U.S. troops get kicked out of the Iraq, or...
All right, so his influence in the region grows.
Correct.
Yeah. And he, of course, is trying to protect his military base in Syria, although there's lots of oil to be had in Iran and Iraq. And, it's a mess.
Everybody is happy.
Yeah. So how do you see this playing out?
I didn't get the question. Sorry.
How do you see this playing out? What do you think is going to happen next?
I think that was all. Probably there will be some deal between Iran and U.S. Maybe. I'm not sure.
So Trump will, just like he did with NAFTA, Trump will renegotiate something and say, I'm the great negotiator, and it'll be basically what we had before with a few cosmetic differences.
Correct, and with North Korea.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. I mean, that would be probably the least terrible outcome. Abraham, thank you very much for the call. I appreciate it. Great to hear from you. And thanks for listening to 91.3 FM there in Seattle. It's 22 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls and the news of the day right after this. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Well, you'll recall when Congressman Pocan was on for the first hour, it's Wednesday. The first hour is typically Middays with Mark, where the congressman comes on and takes phone calls for a full hour like Bernie used to. And, these days it's Congressman Mark Pocan and occasionally Congressman Ro Khan. In fact, I think he's going to be with us day after tomorrow, Friday. And occasionally even Pramila Jayapal drops by and does that. And of course, the door is open to any members of Congress who want to do a national town hall via this program. But Congressman Pocan had to leave 10 minutes early because he had to get down to the floor of the House or wherever it was that they were having this top secret meeting, or not top secret, but a classified briefing where all 435 members of the U.S. House of Representatives were simultaneously briefed on what happened in Iran. And what we have seen now in the press, in the media, it's been on CNN, I've read it in the Washington Post, the New York Times, online, is that members of Congress are coming out of that briefing. Now they're briefing the Senate as we speak. But the members of the House have come out of that briefing that Congressman Pocan had to leave early to attend, and saying that basically what the Trump administration said was, A, they had the authority to kill Mr. Soleimani, Qasem Soleimani, because of Article 2 of the Constitution. In other words, the president is commander-in-chief of the military, and we are, in a time of war. That was their theory, number one, which is, I think, fairly easily knocked down. It's not what the Constitution says. I mean, it does say he's the commander-in-chief of the military, but it doesn't say that he gets to make decisions about war and peace. He gets to fight wars after Congress has told him you have to do that. And number two is Congress was just told just a few minutes ago that the other reason why it was legal for Donald Trump to assassinate the number 2 or 3 guy in the Iranian government was the authorization to use military force that Bush and Cheney lied us into right after 9/11, which set up the invasion of Iraq, which said that the president has the authority to use the military to move without congressional pre-approval against forces, individuals, or organizations who were involved directly or indirectly with planning or executing the attacks on the United States in 9/11. Now, just to be clear, 17, as I recall, the 19 hijackers were Saudis, and the one guy who didn't go along, who was supposed to, but ended up not flying, I believe, was a Saudi. All of them were Sunni Muslims. None of them were Shia. Iran is a Shia country. Iran is hostile to the Sunnis. Soleimani, this general, in addition to fighting the American invaders into Iraq, which is now the ally of Iran, was also, his biggest job was fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Iran has been fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda from the get-go, just like Saddam Hussein was. Saddam Hussein hated Al-Qaeda and kept them out of his country. So what we have done is we've handed another victory to Al-Qaeda by taking this guy out. I mean, this is how bizarre all this is getting. But the administration is claiming that somehow Iran and Soleimani had something to do with 9/11, and therefore Trump was justified in taking them out, which is just a complete lie. So it's breathtaking, the audacity. Will he get away with it? Or will this become another article of impeachment? Will Congress successfully hold hearings into this? I sure hope so.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
I would think that Adam Schiff's Intelligence Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee would want to be getting to the bottom of this as soon as possible in the U.S. House of Representatives. Let's hope so. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Mind Blank, Cambridge Analytica and the Plot to Break America by Christopher Wiley. My life now looks, this is from the Revelations chapter, next to the last chapter. My life now looks like that of a paranoid man, but after being assaulted in the street, receiving threats from rogue private security firms, having my hotel room broken into late at night as I was sleeping, and experiencing 2 hacking attempts on my email in the past 12 months, it's only sensible to be cautious. When I had my flat checked for security risks, the TV was deemed a risk, as it could be used to watch or listen to me without my ever knowing. As we dismantled it, I smiled at the irony of a TV that watches you. In the days leading up to the story's publication, when Facebook began sending me legal threats and escalated my case up to its deputy general counsel and vice president, my lawyers realized that the company saw my whistleblowing as a major threat to its business. Having experience on other hacking cases, my lawyers knew what companies backed into a corner were willing to do. But Facebook was different. They did not need to hack me. They could simply track me everywhere because of the apps on my phone, where I was, who my contacts were, who I was meeting. I disposed of my phone, and my lawyers bought new clean phones that have never touched Facebook, Instagram, or WhatsApp. The terms and conditions of Facebook's mobile app ask for microphone and camera access. Although the company is at pains to deny pulling user audio data for targeted advertising, there is nonetheless a technical permission sitting on our phones that allows access to audio capabilities. And I was not an average user. I was the company's biggest reputational threat at the time. At least in theory, audio could be activated, and my lawyers were concerned that the company could listen in on my conversations with them or with the police. Facebook already had access to my photos and my camera, which put them in a position to not just listen to me, but also to see where I was. Even if I was alone in the bathroom taking a shower, I wasn't ever really alone. If my phone was there, so was Facebook. There was no escape. But getting rid of my phone wasn't going to be enough. My mom, dad, and sisters all had to remove Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp from their phones for the same reason. But Facebook also knew who all my friends were. They knew where they liked to go out, what we wrote about in messages, and they knew where we all lived. Even hanging out with my friends became a risk, as Facebook had access to their phones. If a friend took a photo, Facebook could access it. And in facial recognition algorithms could, at least in theory, detect my face in the photos sitting on other people's phones, even if they were strangers to me. As I was getting rid of my old electronics, my friends joked that it was as if I was exorcising the demons inside the machines. And one friend even brought over some sage to burn, just in case. A funny gesture, of course, but in a way it really was an exorcism. We now live in a world where there are invisible spirits made of code and data that have the power to watch us, listen to us, and think about us. And I wanted these specters gone from my life. On March 16, 2018, a day before The Guardian and The New York Times published my story, Facebook announced that it was banning me, not only from Facebook, but also Instagram. Facebook had refused to ban white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and other armies of hate, but it had chosen to ban me. The company demanded that I hand over my phone and personal computer and said that the only way for me to be reinstated was, in effect, to give them the same information I was providing the authorities. Facebook behaved as if it were a nation state rather than a company. The firm did not seem to understand that I was not the subject of investigation. They were. My lawyers advised me to refuse their demands so as not to interfere with a lawful police and regulatory investigation. Later, when I was working with the authorities, the ban made it far more difficult to hand over evidence that was sitting on my Facebook account, and the investigation into what happened during the Brexit referendum suffered as a result. They say you appreciate something only when it's gone, and it was only when I was erased from Facebook that I truly realized how frequently my life touched their platform. Several of my phone's apps stopped working, a dating app, a taxi app, a messaging app, because they used Facebook authentication. Subscriptions and accounts I had on websites failed for the same reason. People often talk about a dualism, the cyber world and our real lives. But after having most of my digital identity confiscated, I can tell you that they are not separate. When you are erased from social media, you lose touch with people. I stopped getting invited to parties, not intentionally, but because those invites also happened on Facebook or were posted on Instagram. Friends who did not have my new phone number found it nearly impossible to get a hold of me, except for trying to send an email to my lawyers. When I got through the thick of the whistleblowing, it would only be in coincidental encounters at clubs or bars that I would make contact with people I had not seen in months. And now when guys on dating apps ask to check out my Instagram profile, it starts an awkward explanation of how I was banned and that I'm not catfishing, I promise. It's as if my identity has been confiscated and people no longer believe I am who I say I am. Sometimes I get recognized as that guy, and people worry that someone might start watching them if they decide to meet me. I always tell them that they needn't worry because these companies are already tracking them 24/7. This ban was nothing more than a dick move by Facebook, and it felt like trolling by frightened bullies. For me, it created at most an annoying personal hassle and was not nearly as consequential to my life as the kinds of retaliation that other whistleblowers have experienced, not to mention the degree of damage to modern society that the platform has already aided and abetted. But it showed me just how integral my online identity had become to so many facets of my life. The book by Christopher Wiley.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, 34 minutes past the hour. Abby in Long Beach, California, listening on Sirius XM. Hey, Abby, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I was actually, I'm sorry. I had a follow-up question about the Real ID.
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
So, I mean, to put it bluntly and don't beat around the bush, are Mexican passports allowed to travel domestically?
As far, I'm assuming if you have a visa, a tourist visa or a work visa, that there would be no problem. Whether they're going to be enforcing that, I mean, if somebody's in the United States, it's gonna require some form of proof of citizenship. At least this is my understanding of it, Abby. I'm not an expert on the Real ID law, and I might be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure I'm not. If you don't have a star on your driver's license, it means that the state that issued your driver's license is not vouching for your U.S. citizenship, which means that you would have to, if you're asserting U.S. citizenship, you would have to show a passport. If you're not a U.S. citizen and you have a driver's license, and it's perfectly fine to get a driver's license if you're in this country legally, and in many states, actually, if you're in this country without legal authorization, you can still get a driver's license. You don't have that gold star, and in that case, you would have to, I believe that you would have, in order to fly, you would still have to present some form of proof of citizenship someplace and legal status within the United States. This could become another way of basically, suppressing people who are, quote, illegal immigrants, undocumented persons. And I need to dig a little deeper into that, because if we've got 12 million people in this country, go ahead.
Yeah, no, because I was reading the TSA website, and it lists all the accepted forms of ID to travel, right. And it does say, where was it? Foreign government issued passport.
Correct. But then the question comes, okay, let's say that you're a Mexican citizen and you have a Mexican passport with you and you want to fly, but your visa expired 3 months ago. Do they let you fly or not? I don't know the answer to that question.
I don't know.
But I'm guessing if Stephen Miller has anything to say about it, they're going to do everything they can to stop people. This is probably a fight that's going to get real interesting in October, just in time for the election, right? Another way of throwing, gasoline on this particular fire, for these crazy people. So, anyhow, thanks a lot for the call.
Someone asked. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, and if you find out, by the way, it sounds like you're more concerned. You may have a direct personal concern with regard to this. Call me and let me know, okay?
Well, somebody asked me, and I was like, then you had a question. I was like, wait, let me follow up. Maybe I could answer that question. Yeah. To who asked me.
Yeah.
But, okay.
Yeah. Let's both try and find out. Okay, Abby, thanks a lot for the call. Chaz in Lakewood, Washington. Hey, Chaz, what's up?
Nasa Drovia, comrade.
Oh, yeah. Happy, what are we calling it? Trumpistan? Yes.
Oh, yeah. I'm trying to spare you guys that, because hopefully after impeachment, we're getting a little closer to it being, God bless America or whatever. Yeah. But this gold star thing is just creeping me out, and then I'll get to my question. It's almost, don't you see it as kind of like a reverse Star of David?
No. It's first of all, it's a 5-pointed star, and secondly, unlike the Republicans, they didn't flip it upside down to turn it into the satanic star. It's a right side up star.
My point is that if you had a Star of David, you are marked, but now those who don't have a gold star are marked.
Yeah, if they want to fly.
Yeah. All right. So, or leave the country. I'm not too far from the Canadian border.
Yeah.
Now, my question here is that, Trump got his fingers caught in the cookie jar, but we are still sending thousands of troops off to the Middle East.
Correct. They're arriving in Kuwait. Well, I guess they were arriving yesterday. But yeah.
Yeah, I was in Kuwait for a while, and it just, creeps me out that apparently I get creeped out easily, that now we're falling into the exact same scenario of the push for weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah. Yep. Surprise, surprise. I mean, this is what we get with Republicans and liars in the White House. Chaz, thanks for the call. Tom in Newport, Oregon. Hey, Tom, what's up?
Hi, Tom. It's been a long time. I've been trying to get a hold of you. I think you're a wonderful guy, and I like your information. But I just wanted to state is why does our government make all these laws for you, the common guy, but they continue to not live by them? It just bothers me.
For example?
Well, like Trump and all his cronies, and they just seem to not live up to the laws that they make.
Yeah, if you're sufficiently wealthy in the United States, you can largely ignore the laws, and if you're sufficiently wealthy and male and white, you get a double down on that, being able to ignore the laws, and it's just the way it is. Tom, thanks for the call. Sharon in Flint, Michigan. Hey, Sharon, what's up? Thanks for watching us on YouTube.
Hi, Tom.
Hey.
How you doing?
Good. What's up?
I hear a lot. I watch and listen to a lot of social media, and they're all the time saying Trump is the most powerful man on earth, the greatest. They are He watches a lot of TV apparently, and watches a lot of this stuff. So they're pumping his head fuller and bigger and bigger, and they're always leaving out the fact that we have a Congress and we have a Senate, and he's a equal part of this. Three.
That's right. In fact, the House and Senate are the first among equals.
Huh?
In fact, the House and Senate are the first among equals. They're the Article 1 branch of government, and that was no mistake.
Yeah. So the media is partly to fault for some of his nuts activities because they keep telling him most powerful man. No, he's the biggest killer of people on earth. We're not the most powerful country. We are lacking in many, many things, and I don't know. I wish they would stop.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would call him the biggest killer, but I would certainly agree that it's not a phrase that should be used to describe him. Sharon, thank you for the call. Jeff in Portland. Hey, Jeff, what's up?
Hey, good morning, Tom. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I want to refer back to your provocative show opening yesterday. You used the analogy of the rise of Orban in Hungary and the loss of democracy there to ask if the same thing could happen here in the USA. And some people might scoff and say, we've had democracy here for over 240 years, whereas you pointed out in Hungary it only lasted 18 or 19 years before the autocratic rule took over. However, Tom, if you look at what's happened here since 9/11, which is coincidentally about 18 or so years, we've seen Congress dramatically relinquish its war powers to the executive branch, whether it's Bush, Obama, and now Trump. So, Tom, while we hope the Iranians can constrain the network of militias that Soleimani set up, at the same time, we need to be calling on Congress to constrain Trump and Congress needs to take back its war powers as dictated in the Constitution. There are bills. Pelosi has a bill in the House to do that, and Tim Kaine in the Senate, and then Ro Khanna and Bernie Sanders have additional bills that would specifically require congressional approval for funding on any strikes on Iran.
Yes.
And then, and of course, as you mentioned, impeachment. That's something. All this stuff we can still look into under the investigations in the House, and I think the brilliance of Pelosi holding on to those articles is that this does the more it looks like a wag the dog situation. Whereas he wanted to get rid of that impeachment, get it through the Senate, get himself acquitted, and then do this. I think this is not something that just happened out of the blue. I think you've talked about how he mentioned years ago about how Obama would start a war to get reelected. I think that he's been planning this well in advance.
I agree. And I think that obviously he's been thinking about this for years, because he was predicting that Obama would do it in 2012, which was 8 years ago. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that my personal opinion is that the reason why he attacked Soleimani was specifically and largely exclusively to divert the attention of the media and of the American people away from the impeachment inquiry. Jeff, thanks for the call. Alicia in Eureka, Montana. Hey, Alicia, thanks for watching us on Facebook Live. What's up?
Good afternoon, Tom. I was going to talk to you about the Real ID.
Yeah. Do you know more about it than I do?
Maybe a little bit.
Okay, go for it.
The law actually went into effect, I believe, in 2006. It was a long time ago.
No, I know that, but the sign in the airport that I passed just a couple of weeks ago says, starting in October of 2020, you must have a star on your driver's license, or you won't be able to go through
I understand
security.
That. Several states have been objecting to it, Montana being one of them.
Right, and Oregon being one of them.
So we kept getting extensions, and they finally Montana has finally conceded and just said, okay, whatever, we'll go for it. So I actually went in this June and got my Real ID, and I needed 6 pieces of other identification to get it. I needed my birth certificate. I needed a marriage license that showed my name change. I needed 2 pieces of documentation that had my physical address. I used the deed to my house and my auto insurance policy, and I also had to have my Social Security card, and I can't remember there were 6 of them. And I was born and raised in this state, and that's what I had to go through to get this ID. And I could have gone with a lesser version, but with that lesser version, I wouldn't be allowed to fly.
Yeah.
So it is required to fly out of the state of Montana as of 2020. I'm just saying that the law actually went into effect a long time ago, and several states have been fighting it.
Yes.
Apparently, Oregon's one of them.
Yeah. Yeah, so, and we're still waiting for Oregon to issue the ID. And in my opinion, this was just another effort by Republicans to make it harder to get driver's licenses, because at the same time they're trying to say that you can't vote without a driver's license. And
I had to do a lot of digging through papers to be able to get one, and I've been here my whole life. That's exactly what it was.
It can be not just a challenge; it can be an expensive challenge. I mean, getting a certified copy of your birth certificate can cost you $100 in most places. Alicia, thank you. Thank you for the call, and thanks for adding to the conversation. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archive.
46 minutes past the hour. Back with more of your calls in just a moment. And welcome back. Michael in Princeton, Minnesota. Hey, Michael, what's up?
Hello, Tom. See, I was watching your segment with the guy from Australia. You're reporting on the fires and stuff. Mm-hmm. And our news is saying that they've arrested 24 people that started some of these fires.
They have. Same thing happened in California. My recollection was it was 13 or 14 people got arrested in California for starting fires.
Oh, was there that many?
That's my recollection. I may be wrong, but there were some people arrested there, too. I mean, you're going to have crazy people. You're going to have firebugs and pyromaniacs and idiots, and some of them started them intentionally, and some of them were just out camping when they shouldn't have been. But that's not what's causing the fires in Australia. What's causing the fires in Australia is climate change.
Oh, I agree with you on that. They did say that 2 of them were started, one from a campfire and one was from somebody burning recklessly.
Yeah.
But with that many involved, I was just wondering if there was a conspiracy. And also, we don't hear anything at all about what's happening to the Aborigines over there. I mean, we hear about the animals and all that.
I've lived and worked in Australia, and I haven't lived there very long, but I've been there a lot, and I did work there. And in fact, worked in an Aboriginal community up right on the outskirts of Cairns, and also in Petford, up in the northern part of Australia, right off the Great Barrier Reef. And the Aboriginal communities are just like the white communities in terms of lifestyle. I mean, they tend to be poorer, but they're living in cities and living in houses, and so it's not like living out in the bush kind of thing. It's very much like Native Americans here, to some extent. So I don't specifically know how this is impacting Aboriginal communities in Australia. But in terms of arresting 24 people, keep in mind the entire continent of Australia right now is experiencing wildfires. There's not any state in Australia that's not experiencing wildfire. In the United States, it was largely California, and a little bit of it came up into Oregon. So if California, and if you were to overlay the map of the continent of Australia on top of a map of the lower 48 of the U.S., they're nearly identical in terms of square footage or square miles or whatever. We're about the same size. So if you could imagine that the California fires weren't just burning in California, but were burning all across the United States, from California all the way to New York State, all the way down to Florida and Texas, all the way up to Montana and Michigan. If that was the case, and that many people were involved and that large a landmass was involved, I'm guessing that far more than 24 people would be arrested for everything from, inappropriately burning trash and campfires to arson. So it's not. I
sure hope they can get them put out. I understand that when they do get rain, it hinders the backfires.
Yeah, it may. I'm guessing that they would plan for that because the backfires are planned. But I did see the headline over on Breitbart yesterday that implied that the whole Australian problem had nothing to do with climate change, that it was because some crazy people were setting fires. And that is just complete nonsense. Michael, thanks for the call. Margie in Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin. Margie, you have some more information on Real ID?
Yes. Some other things that you need is
Margie, I'm going to have to put you on hold. I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was going to hit this break, and I'll pick you back up in 4 minutes because you're listening on Sirius XM. So I'll pick you up on the other end of your commercial break. So hold on, we'll be right back with Margie. Stick around. It is 10 minutes before the hour. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Margie in Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin. I'm sorry I cut you off, Margie. What's up? Real ID.
Hey, Tom. Real ID. Some other things that you need is proof of residency, which has to be a utility bill, which is making it very challenging for people who live in either a communal situation or minors still living with their parents.
Oh my.
The other thing is that you have to document. This is so anti-woman. You have to document every name change you have ever had. I was at DMV in Wisconsin doing my driver's license, and there was a woman literally bawling because she had been married and divorced a few times. So they're also, this is basically shaming women who have been married more than once.
Yeah, I came across this when I was writing, the hidden history of the war on voting. I was, I guess, ultimately not surprised, but it hadn't occurred to me before that the voter ID laws to vote are having a disproportionate impact on women, because if you show up to vote with an ID that is, let's say that when you originally registered as Margie Smith, and then, you got married to Mr. Jones and you changed your name to Jones, but your original voter registration was under Smith. You can't just bring in your ID and say, this is me, I'm Margie Jones now. You've got to show that you used to be Margie Smith, and here's the actual, here's your what we call marriage license, and here's the application that you submitted to the state for changing your name, and here's the state's certification back to you that your name change is actually legal, and all this kind of nonsense. It's crazy.
Absolutely. And this is where, I mean, it is very difficult. I mean, it's exceedingly difficult to get these. It took me quite a while, and I was challenged on my birth certificate.
Yeah, and it also makes it almost impossible.
I'm adopted.
Yeah, well, there you go. And it also makes it almost impossible for homeless people to get a driver's license. Trans people will have the same challenge. I mean, this, what we're looking at, and it's going to, like I said, it's going to kick in full force in October of this year. What we're looking at, in my opinion, is voter suppression on steroids. Thanks a lot for the call, Margie. Jen in Grand River, Iowa. Hey, Jen, you wanted to talk about Real ID too?
Yeah. Are you there?
I am. You're on the air.
Yeah. Okay. I'm a truck driver, and I've had one for like almost 3 years because of hazmat.
Mm-hmm.
And then to get on a military base I deliver inside of prisons, you got to have it there.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, if I want to go to Omaha, Des Moines, or Kansas City, get on an airplane, I can just go and get on. Now, with that being said, my wife just got hers last September, and she's in Missouri. Now, she had to show like 4 things. And it was like a piece of cake, and it was done.
So it's easier in some states than others? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's apparently from what I'm hearing on your radio show, there's a lot of difference. Like Montana, there's a whole bunch of things they got to go through. Down there, like in Missouri, my wife got along just really easy. Went down the street, took her birth certificate, Social Security card, form of a bill. And I think that's about 4 things. And then I told her, I said, get the Real ID because we want to get on a plane.
Yeah.
You'll be standing back there and I'll be gone.
Yeah.
So,
and ultimately you're going to.
It's a good deal.
Yeah, and ultimately you're going to want to vote. It used to be if you needed to prove your citizenship, you needed to pull out your passport. And if you're in the United States, you don't need to prove your citizenship. I mean, that was just, conventional wisdom for 235 years. And then the vote suppressors came along and, this was their major freakout. Thanks a lot for the call, Jen. John in El Prado, New Mexico. Hey, John, what's up?
Hi, Tom. If John Bolton is so ready to testify in front of the Senate, why doesn't Nancy Pelosi subpoena him and have him testify in front of the House?
That will almost certainly happen, John. It won't be Nancy Pelosi. It'll probably be Adam Schiff in the Intelligence Committee. Or it could, it could be Jerry Nadler with the Judiciary. There's a couple of different committees who would have overlapping jurisdiction here, but I suspect that that's going to happen, and it's going to happen in the next week or so. I'd be very surprised if it doesn't. And just to add to this, I believe that the reason why John Bolton wants to testify, and this would speak to why he would also testify to the House instead of the Senate, is that he's writing a tell-all book about his time in the White House. And when you write a tell-all book, you've got to have it vetted by the agency whose secrets you're telling. And so there's going to be a bunch of stuff about his time in the White House that Trump doesn't want him talking about in his book. And so the White House will never vet his book. But if he can say these things in open session, in the congressional record, the congressional record is public domain. It's not, it's no longer classified and it's not copyrighted. And so he will be able then to take that content and say, I don't have to have my book vetted by the White House. I don't have to have Trump's permission to tell these stories because I already told Congress and I did it under subpoena. I was forced to do it. And then he can get his $1 million advance or whatever it is. John, thanks a lot for the call. But, all that said, I still think we need to hear from John Bolton because apparently he was one of the few people who, as much as crazy as he is, wanting to bomb Iran and everything else, he was one of the few people who thought it was a stupid idea to blackmail a foreign government in order to smear Joe Biden. Incredible stuff. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, don't forget democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires you. So get out there, get active, tag You're It, and tell your friends how to find progressive media. Turn them on to our program and others. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.